It started as a quiet plan to be alone for a few days. I had been working nonstop for months, barely sleeping or seeing anyone. My head was constantly full of noise, emails, deadlines, city traffic, people talking over each other. I needed silence. So one weekend, I booked a small wooden cabin far out in the forest, about 4 hours from the nearest town. It was cheap, had good reviews, and the pictures made it look peaceful, small, simple, surrounded by tall pine trees and a lake not too far from it. The drive there was long but easy. The last part of the road turned into gravel and then a dirt path, narrow and full of bumps. My car moved slowly as trees started closing in from both sides. The further I went, the quieter it became. The sound of my tires over the dirt and the occasional bird were the only noises I could hear. When I finally reached the cabin, I parked in front of a small clearing surrounded by thick woods. The cabin looked exactly like in the pictures. Small porch, wooden stairs, one window on each side, a chimney on the top. It looked old but clean. The wood was dark from years of weather, but it had a certain charm. There was a short trail leading to what looked like an outhouse or storage shed a bit behind the cabin. I remember thinking how isolated it felt. No other houses, no cell service, not even a sign of another car passing through. Inside, everything was simple but cozy. A single room with a small bed, a table, 2 chairs, a stove, a counter with a sink that worked on a water pump, and a fireplace. There was also a small back room that looked like a storage closet, full of old tools and cleaning stuff. The first few hours were peaceful. I unpacked my things, set up some food I'd brought, and sat on the porch, listening to the wind moving through the trees. By evening, the temperature dropped. I lit a fire in the small fireplace and sat near it with a book. I remember how quiet it was. So quiet that when the fire cracked, it made me jump. I told myself I wasn't used to that kind of silence. In the city, you get used to a constant background noise. Out here, even your own breathing feels loud. When it got dark, I stepped outside for a bit. The night was colder than I expected. The air smelled like wet pine, and the moonlight was faint through the trees. I stood there for a while, trying to enjoy the calm, but something about that darkness felt heavy. I could hear small sounds around, branches snapping, leaves moving, something rustling far in the woods. Probably animals, I told myself, but the sounds didn't fade. They moved slowly, like someone circling through the woods. I went back inside, shut the door, and locked it. The lock was old and weak, just a small metal latch, but it was something. I didn't think much of it at first. I put a pot on the stove, made some noodles, and went to bed early. It must have been around midnight when I woke up. The fire had burned low, and the cabin was almost completely dark except for a faint orange glow from the last embers. What woke me was a soft sound, something like footsteps on the wooden porch outside. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal. The porch steps creaked once, then again, then stopped. I stayed still, listening. Nothing. Then, faintly, I heard the sound of breathing near the wall, slow, steady, like someone standing just outside the window. I lay there frozen, barely breathing. My first thought was to check the window, but I couldn't move. I didn't even want to see what was out there. After a few seconds that felt much longer, the sound faded. The steps creaked again, this time moving away from the cabin. After a while, it was silent again. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for another sound. The next morning, everything looked normal. The woods were quiet again, the air cold and clear. I walked outside to check around. The porch had dirt marks on it, small ones maybe from boots. I told myself they might have already been there. The ground around the cabin was covered in dry needles, so it was hard to tell if anyone had been walking there recently. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there. I spent the day trying to distract myself. I chopped some wood, made coffee, and went for a short walk down a trail that led to the lake. The lake was calm and empty, surrounded by trees that leaned slightly toward the water. I stayed there for a while, sitting on a rock, trying to convince myself that the night before was nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was an animal or the wind. When I came back to the cabin in the afternoon, I noticed something small but strange. The back door, which I hadn't used, was unlocked. I was sure I'd checked all the locks when I arrived. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember. Maybe I missed it. Maybe the latch was loose. I locked it again, double-checked the front, and tried to ignore it. That night, I went to bed earlier. I left the lantern burning low beside the bed and kept the fire going a bit longer. I stayed awake for a while, listening again. It was quiet for hours. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it again. Soft steps, slow, careful, like someone walking just outside. This time, they didn't come to the porch right away. They stopped near the back wall. I could hear faint movements, maybe near the window. Then, a very light scraping sound, like fingernails brushing wood. I got up slowly, heart pounding. I wanted to check, but fear kept me frozen halfway. I stood near the bed, barely breathing, staring at the window. The noise stopped, then silence. I waited still for almost an hour before I dared move again. I didn't sleep at all after that. In the morning, I walked around again. The back wall had faint marks near the window, tiny scratches, almost like something had rubbed against it. I checked the lock again. It was still fine, but now I noticed something else. Under the window, hidden between the logs, there was a small gap, like a piece of the wall had shifted slightly. You couldn't see it unless you crouched. It looked like someone had pried the wood a little. I told myself it might have been old damage. The cabin was probably decades old. But now the silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt watchful. I decided to cut my trip short. I planned to leave the next morning, pack up everything, and drive back. But that night turned out worse than the rest. I tried to stay awake as long as I could. I sat near the fireplace, reading, drinking coffee, keeping the lantern on. Around 2 a.m., I started hearing it again. The same slow steps outside, circling the cabin. I could tell it was footsteps this time, not animals. The sound of weight pressing on wood, shifting on the dirt. Then came the sound of the back door handle, softly, slowly, turning. I froze completely. I watched the handle shake just once. Then silence. After a while, I heard the faintest sound, breathing again, right outside the door. Minutes passed. I didn't move. The fire burned low again, the room dark except for the faint glow. Then, suddenly, the sound of something tapping on the wall, slow, steady, like someone pressing a finger against the wood. 3 times. Then silence. I couldn't stay still anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly checked every corner inside. Everything was locked. The windows were shut. Nothing was moved. But I knew someone was out there. I didn't know how close or why. I stayed awake till morning, sitting near the window, watching the woods until daylight came. As soon as the sun was up, I packed everything as fast as I could. I loaded my bag, locked the cabin, and went to the car. But when I got in, the car wouldn't start. The engine turned but wouldn't catch. I tried again and again, but it just clicked. My hands started shaking. I opened the hood, checked what I could, but I knew nothing about engines. Everything looked normal. I looked around the trees, trying to calm down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. I decided to walk. The nearest road was about 5 miles back, according to the map. I took a bottle of water, locked the car, and started walking fast. The forest was quiet, but I kept looking behind me. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something following, branches snapping, faint footsteps, maybe echoes of my own. When I finally reached the main road, I felt like I could breathe again. A few hours later, a truck passed by and gave me a lift to town. Later that day, I called the owner of the cabin to tell him what happened. He seemed calm, said he'd send someone to check the place. I didn't tell him everything, just that I'd heard noises and that the car wouldn't start. A few days later, I got a call from him. He told me something strange. When he went to the cabin, he found the back door unlocked, even though I'd locked it before leaving. Inside, some of the floorboards in the storage closet were loose. Underneath, there was a small space like a crawl area just big enough for a person to fit. Inside it, he found a blanket, a few empty cans of food, and some old clothes. That was when it hit me. Someone had been living under the cabin, probably for a long time. They must have come out at night when they heard someone new inside. Maybe they'd been living there quietly, unnoticed, using the woods for food, sleeping during the day. I had spent 3 nights there, not knowing that someone was hiding just a few feet beneath me. After that, I stopped renting remote places. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd been to something I never saw. Every small sound, every scratch I heard that weekend, it wasn't the wind, it wasn't animals. It was someone who lived in the dark, listening while I slept, moving through the same walls that kept me feeling safe. Even now, when I think about it, I remember the soft creak of those steps, the quiet tapping on the wall, and the cold realization that I wasn't alone at all. The next morning, I decided I had to leave. I packed quickly, taking only what I could carry, leaving behind heavier items like firewood. I stepped outside carefully, scanning the surrounding trees. The forest was quiet again, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I took the path down to the creek, my eyes constantly scanning the shadows. As I walked, I saw signs that made my stomach twist. Footprints, larger than mine, that had circled the cabin and followed me partway down the trail. They were fresh, pressed into the soft earth, and they were not from any animal I knew. I realized I had narrowly avoided a dangerous encounter. The forest, so peaceful in daylight, had felt different at night, alive in a way that was threatening and calculated. I walked faster, trying to stay calm. My mind kept running through worst-case scenarios, but I reminded myself that I had survived the night. I focused on staying alert and moving towards safety. I eventually reached a dirt road that I knew connected to the highway. Relief washed over me when I saw a car coming in the distance. I waved frantically, and the car slowed. The driver stopped and listened as I explained that I had stayed in a cabin and someone had been circling it at night. They offered to give me a ride to the nearest town. As we drove, I kept looking back toward the trees, the cabin now hidden behind layers of forest. My hands shook, and my heart still raced, but I realized I was safe. I had survived. I didn't know who had been outside that cabin or what they wanted, but I had made it out alive. In the town, I contacted the local ranger station. They took my report seriously, noting that the area was remote and that other hikers or cabin renters had occasionally reported people lurking near abandoned or rented cabins. They reassured me that I was now far from danger and that authorities would investigate. I never went back to that cabin. The experience left a mark on me. A lesson about the vulnerability that comes with isolation, the need to be prepared, and the unpredictable danger that can exist in the quietest, most beautiful places. I kept my gear, packed in a corner, a reminder of how quickly a peaceful weekend could become a test of survival. Even months later, I remembered the cold air pressing against the cabin walls, the scratching at night, the long moments of silence that were heavier than any sound. But I also remembered how I stayed calm, thought through my options, and took action. That weekend in the cabin taught me something about resilience and awareness, and most importantly, it taught me that survival is as much about staying alert and cautious as it is about luck. I had left the forest physically unharmed, and eventually, I left the fear behind as well, carrying only the memory and the lesson. I had been driving for most of the day, the long highway stretching ahead of me like a ribbon through endless forest. My destination was a small cabin I had rented for the weekend, somewhere deep in the mountains, far away from the noise of the city. I wanted silence, solitude, and the kind of peace you can only get when you are completely alone in nature. The road had narrowed and twisted, the trees pressing close on either side, making the sunlight scatter through the branches in thin, trembling lines. Every mile deeper into the forest made me feel like the world I knew had fallen away, replaced by something quieter, slower, more dangerous in its calm. The cabin appeared after I turned off a gravel road, tucked between 2 steep hills and surrounded by thick pines. It was small, wooden, with a stone chimney and a porch that had weathered years of wind and snow. There was no cell phone signal, barely any hint of human life for miles. The air smelled clean, cold, and earthy, carrying the scent of damp pine needles and moss. I parked and got out, my boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. The silence hit me first, the kind of silence that presses on your chest and makes your ears ring. There was no wind, No birds, no rustle of small animals. Just the faint creak of trees swaying somewhere above me. I carried my bags inside. The cabin was simple, one main room with a small kitchen area, a fireplace with a pile of dry logs, and a loft with a bed. The windows were old, glass slightly fogged and wavy, but they let in a decent view of the surrounding woods. I unpacked slowly, taking in the details. The worn wooden floor, the smell of dust mixed with pine, the thin layer of grime on the windowsills. Felt untouched, like someone had just disappeared from here years ago. As the sun lowered behind the trees, the light changed. Shadows stretched and deepened across the walls, and the air grew colder. I started a fire in the fireplace, the warmth of the flames cutting the chill in the cabin. The first night was quiet, but not peaceful. Every small sound, a creak in the floorboards, the rattle of the window frames, the distant snap of a branch outside, made me tense. I kept reminding myself I was safe, that the forest outside was normal and predictable. But deep down, something about the isolation made me uneasy, like being watched by eyes I couldn't see. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking at every tiny noise. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps on the porch. My heart raced, and I forced myself to listen carefully. Nothing followed, no thump, no shadow at the window, just the wind shifting the branches outside. Eventually, I fell asleep sitting up in bed, firelight flickering across the walls. Morning brought some relief. The sun was pale, slanting through the trees and warming the cabin slightly. I went outside, stretched, and started exploring the area. The cabin was on a small clearing surrounded by thick forest, with a narrow dirt path leading downhill toward a creek. I walked carefully, noticing animal tracks in the frost. Deer, raccoon, maybe a coyote. Everything seemed quiet, but again, the quiet itself felt like a warning. I spent the day preparing for my weekend. I chopped wood, gathered water from the creek, and cleaned the cabin as best I could. The work kept my mind occupied, and I started to feel a little safer. As evening came, I built a bigger fire in the fireplace, cooked a small dinner, and sat by the flames. The forest outside looked different in the dim light. Shadows longer, trees more solid, the air heavy with the smell of damp leaves. I felt that old tension creep back in, but I told myself it was natural, that it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. Night fell faster than I expected. I was in the loft, lying under blankets, listening to the fire crackle below, when I heard it again. The faint sound at first, almost like scraping. My heart jumped. I froze. The sound came again, soft but deliberate, coming from outside the cabin. Not wind, not animal. Something or someone was moving near the walls. I stayed completely still, listening. The scratching grew closer, circling the cabin, moving from one side to another. I realized it wasn't random. Someone or something was intentionally moving around me. My stomach tightened, my throat dry. I wanted to call for help, but my phone had no signal. I checked the windows. They were locked, but the sound was close enough that I could imagine fingers against the wood, trying doors or testing walls. I remembered the tools I had brought. I had a small hunting knife, a hammer, and some rope. I grabbed the knife and held it in my hand, my other hand near the hammer. The sound stopped abruptly. Silence again, heavier this time, like it was waiting for me to act. My mind raced, trying to think rationally. Could it be an animal? But the sound was deliberate, measured, moving with intelligence. I realized I was not alone. I decided to prepare. I moved quietly to the kitchen, taking the rope and hammer. I checked the windows, securing them as best I could. I moved slowly, trying not to make any noise that would give away my position. The fire in the fireplace threw flickering light across the cabin, casting long shadows that made the space feel smaller, more dangerous. Hours passed. I didn't hear the noise again, but I stayed awake, alert, and tense. I watched the forest through the windows, looking for movement, listening for the slightest sound. Sleep became impossible. Every crack of wood, every snap of a twig, made my heart leap. I had been driving for hours, following narrow, twisting roads that seemed to disappear into thick stands of pine and spruce. The sun was already low when I finally reached the turnoff. The map had shown a small, unnamed road branching off the main highway, winding up into the hills, and that's where the cabin was supposed to be. My old sedan groaned as I forced it over ruts and patches of gravel, each bump echoing in the dense forest. I had chosen this cabin because it promised isolation, a chance to be completely alone for a week. I wanted to write, to think, to escape the constant pressure of work and city noise. The ad online made it sound perfect, rustic, private, no neighbors for miles. When I finally reached the cabin, I was greeted by silence. The clearing was small, surrounded by tall trees, their trunks dark and rough, their branches heavy with the scent of pine. The cabin itself was a squat wooden structure, older than I expected, with a metal roof streaked with rust. The windows were dusty and streaked with grime. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and something faintly sour, like mold that had been lingering for months. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight that filtered through the dirty windows. The place was furnished minimally. A small kitchen table, a few chairs, a bed with a faded mattress, and a wood-burning stove. I set my bag down and walked through the cabin, checking every corner. There was no electricity, no running water, just a well outside. This was exactly what I had signed up for. I took a deep breath and tried to shake off the exhaustion from the long drive. I unpacked my bag, arranging my notebooks, pens, and a small pack of food. Then I stacked some dry wood near the stove and started a fire. The crackling of the flames was comforting, the heat slowly warming the chill that had settled into my bones. By evening, the light outside was fading fast. The forest around the cabin grew darker, the shadows stretching long and thin. I could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the occasional creak of branches. The sound was almost hypnotic, soothing at first, but then I noticed something else. A faint sound, almost imperceptible at first. A snap of a twig, a brush of movement. I froze and listened. There was nothing, just the wind and the trees. I told myself it was impossible. This was the middle of nowhere, no one else for miles. Still, my stomach tightened. I tried to focus on writing, but every little sound made me jump. The wind seemed to pick up, rattling the roof, tugging at the eaves. Somewhere outside, I heard a low, dragging sound. My eyes darted to the window. The forest was black now, but the darkness seemed alive, pressing close to the cabin. I convinced myself it was an animal. Deer, maybe a raccoon. Nothing more. That night, I slept lightly, waking several times to strange sounds outside. The dragging sound came again, closer this time, followed by a sharp crack as if someone had stepped on a branch right outside the door. I sat up in bed, heart racing, staring into the darkness. My mind was spinning through possibilities. Could someone be out there? It didn't make sense. Why would anyone be here? I had a small pistol in my bag, something I had never used before, but it was enough to make me feel a little safer. I clutched it for a while, listening to the wind, until exhaustion finally took me again. The next morning, I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I followed a small path leading down a slight slope to a creek. The water was clear, cold, running fast over smooth stones. I knelt and drank, letting the chill wake me fully. Then I noticed the footprints. They were fresh, muddy impressions in the soft soil, leading from the creek toward the cabin. They were human. My heart sank. I traced them back to the clearing. They stopped at the edge of the cabin. There were no prints leading away. I spent the rest of the day checking the cabin for signs of forced entry, locking the door from the inside, securing the windows as best I could. I tried to focus on my writing again, but my hands shook too much. Every small sound made me tense. A branch scraping the roof, the howl of a distant coyote, the wind moving the leaves. Night came again, darker and colder. I barricaded the door with a chair and a heavy box, making sure the windows were locked. I kept the pistol nearby. Hours passed. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke to a scraping sound at the window. My stomach dropped. I slowly turned my head. Outside, A figure was moving between the trees, just beyond the clearing. I couldn't make out details, but it was definitely human. My pulse shot up. I grabbed the pistol and edged toward the window, trying to stay quiet. The figure froze when it saw me move. Then it disappeared into the forest. I held my breath for a long time, listening. Nothing. I didn't sleep again that night. I spent it watching the forest, fire burning low in the stove, pistol in hand. The sound of movement returned several times, always brief, always from the edge of the trees. I realized that someone had been watching me, maybe following me from the road. Panic and fear were mixing with a strange clarity. I had to get out, but the roads were rough, and it was dark. Morning came reluctantly, gray and overcast. I packed my bag quickly, leaving behind everything I didn't need. I filled a small container with water from the creek and grabbed as much food as I could carry. I double-checked the pistol. Then I moved quietly to the edge of the clearing, scanning the forest. No one was there. I started down the road, taking care not to make too much noise, keeping my eyes on the trees. The hike to the highway was longer than I expected. Every sound of snapping branches made me flinch. I stuck to the road, trying to stay in clear sight, but the dense forest pressed close. Hours passed. My legs ached, and my pack felt heavy. At one point, I thought I saw movement between the trees, but it was gone when I looked directly. I didn't stop to rest much. My fear kept me moving. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the main road. The first car that came by was a small pickup truck. I waved frantically, and the driver slowed, rolling down the window. I explained as quickly as I could, shaking. He nodded, called the sheriff, and offered to give me a ride to the nearest town. Relief washed over me in waves. The deputies met me at the town outskirts. They drove me back to the cabin with a team, but by the time we arrived, there was no one there. Footprints, broken branches, and signs of recent movement were all that remained. They found no one, and the area was searched extensively over the next few days. The sheriff later told me they suspected someone had been living in the forest nearby, watching travelers, but they never found the person. The cabin had been abandoned by its previous renter long before I arrived. I never returned to that forest. The experience stayed with me for a long time. The sense of isolation, the constant fear, the knowledge that someone had been near me, unseen but very real, left a lasting mark. I realized that the wilderness is not inherently safe or peaceful. It is indifferent, and sometimes people make it dangerous. After weeks of anxiety, I began to feel safe again. I moved on with my life, but I never forgot the way the forest looked at night, the sound of twigs snapping under someone else's feet, and the feeling of being watched. I never stayed alone in a cabin again. Eventually, I wrote about it. The experience became a story, a reminder of human presence in the wild, of vulnerability, and of the strange ways isolation can sharpen fear. I shared it cautiously, warning others to respect the forest, to be aware that danger is not always obvious, and that human threats can be closer than expected. The end. Hours seemed to pass in this tension, the footsteps sometimes louder, sometimes barely audible. I stayed in the bedroom, listening and waiting, my grip on the pan tight, firelight flickering across my sweaty palms. Then, in a moment of reckoning, I realized I needed to see who or what was out there. Hiding in fear would only make it worse. I moved to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass, flashlight in hand. At first, I saw nothing but shadows. Then, out of the corner of my eye, movement. A figure, human-sized, dressed in dark clothing, crouched in the trees at the edge of the clearing. I froze, heart hammering. My first thought was panic, call the police, run, barricade the doors. But then I noticed something. The figure wasn't approaching recklessly. It was circling, almost as if observing. Fear mixed with a strange, sharp clarity. This wasn't random. It was calculated. I realized that I needed a plan, and fast. I retraced my steps through the cabin silently, closing curtains, locking doors, and gathering supplies. I had brought extra water, some food, and a small camping knife. My mind raced. I had to stay calm. I set up a small system of barricades, chairs and tables against the doors, enough to slow someone if they tried to force entry. I then positioned myself near the bedroom door, pan in hand, eyes trained on the window. Hours passed like this, the forest silent except for occasional rustles. Exhaustion began to set in. I forced myself to eat, sip water, and stay alert. I could hear the figure moving in the trees, faintly, almost imperceptibly. Every sound was magnified in my ears. My thoughts spiraled through every possibility, every scenario I had read about in news stories or survival guides. I realized I had to take action if the figure didn't leave. At first light, the forest looked less menacing, the shadows retreating with the sun. I cautiously moved to the window and scanned the clearing. The figure was gone. My chest relaxed, but only slightly. I waited, watching the edge of the forest, eyes straining for any movement. Eventually, I stepped outside carefully, my senses on high alert. The clearing was empty, except for the trampled grass and broken branches where someone had been. I walked the perimeter cautiously, noting footprints in the soft dirt and leaf litter. They were large, booted prints, moving in a deliberate pattern around the cabin. I realized then that whoever had done this had watched me closely, learning my routines. My stomach churned at the thought, but I forced myself to remain calm. Panic would have left me vulnerable. After documenting the footprints and taking careful mental notes, I returned to the cabin. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, leaving everything else behind. The drive out was tense, every shadow along the gravel road making me flinch. I reached the main road, finally seeing other cars, other signs of life, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I called the police, explaining the situation and giving the description of the footprints. They assured me an officer would come by, but in reality, it would be hours before anyone could reach the remote cabin. I drove home in silence, not speaking, not thinking beyond the immediate need to get somewhere safe. The city lights were blinding, the constant hum of traffic comforting in its normalcy. That night, I lay in my apartment bed, replaying every detail, every sound, every shadow. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was uneasy. Weeks later, the police followed up. They found no one at the cabin, no signs of forced entry, but the footprints had vanished, and the surrounding forest showed no additional traces. The cabin was empty, undisturbed, and yet, I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. They told me I had acted wisely, that my preparations had likely prevented a break-in or worse. I accepted that, though the memory of that night stayed with me vivid and sharp. Eventually, I returned to the cabin once, during daylight, to collect the few items I had left behind. The forest seemed calm now, the air sweet and quiet, but I couldn't shake the memory of being watched, of the unseen figure circling just beyond the clearing. I reinforced my decision never to stay alone in such isolation again. And yet, part of me admired my own composure during the ordeal. I had survived by thinking, preparing, and staying calm, even when every instinct screamed at me to panic. I never went back for another weekend in that cabin, and I made sure to always have company whenever I went into remote areas after that. The lesson was clear. Nature itself was peaceful, but isolation could hide very real dangers, human dangers, ones that required awareness, preparation, and respect. I had faced it, survived it, and come out stronger, more cautious, but also more aware of the thin line between solitude and vulnerability. The cabin stands empty now, a quiet structure in the woods, harmless in daylight, but I know better. Some nights, I think about the figure that circled it, precise and silent, and I shiver at the memory. But I also remember the fire, the careful barricades, and the decision to act deliberately rather than panic. That knowledge, that control saved me. I learned that fear could be managed, and survival was often about thinking, patience, and staying calm even when the odds seemed frighteningly uncertain. I still remember the smell of the damp pine, the creak of the floorboards, and the cold touch of the night air through the window. I remember the figure in the darkness and the emptiness of the forest when the sun finally rose. And I remember walking away, alive, aware, and more cautious than ever, but alive. That clarity, that ending, is as real as the fear that night had held. I had been driving for hours along winding, narrow roads that cut through dense forest. The GPS on my phone kept flickering between strong and weak signal, and at some point, I realized it might be better not to rely on it at all. I was heading to a cabin I had rented for a week, isolated and far from any town. The photos online had made it look perfect. Wooden, sturdy, with a porch that overlooked a small clearing surrounded by trees. I wanted peace, quiet, a chance to think. Work had been eating at me, and I had grown tired of the noise of the city, the endless chatter and the constant light. I needed silence, and I was willing to drive hours to get it. As the sun started dipping behind the trees, the road became narrower and more rugged. Gravel turned to dirt, and the tire tracks of previous vehicles were faint, half erased by recent rain. I slowed my car to a crawl, gripping the wheel tightly, listening to the crunch of loose stones beneath the tires. There was no one around for miles. I had not seen another car for over an hour. The forest pressed in on either side, dark and silent, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind made me flinch. It was one of those places where every little sound felt amplified. The snap of a branch, the distant caw of a crow, the thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. Finally, I saw it. The cabin was modest, made of dark-stained wood, and perched slightly above the ground. A small porch ran along the front, and the windows reflected the fading light like dark eyes. A thin plume of smoke rose lazily from the chimney, even though it wasn't cold enough for a fire yet. The gravel driveway ended abruptly in a small clearing, the forest pressing close around it. I parked, turned off the engine, and listened. Silence almost absolute, the kind of silence that made the wind sound loud. I took a deep breath and stepped out, the air immediately colder than I expected, carrying the damp smell of wet leaves and earth. The cabin door was unlocked, which surprised me. I pushed it open, and the smell of wood and dust hit me immediately. Inside, the place was rustic but well kept. A small living area with a sofa, a wood-burning stove, and a dining table filled the main room. A narrow hallway led to a couple of bedrooms and a bathroom. Sunlight filtered through the windows, and the shadows stretched long across the wooden floors. I dropped my bag, letting out a slow breath I didn't realize I had been holding. This was exactly what I had imagined. Empty, quiet, and completely alone. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to look at the cabin more closely. The walls had small, shallow scratches, maybe from animals, maybe just marks from years of use. There was a stack of firewood near the stove and a small pile of newspapers in one corner, yellowed with age. The kitchen was tiny, but it had everything I would need: pots, pans, a small fridge, a gas stove. I ran water in the sink. Clear, cold, slightly metallic, but otherwise normal. The cabin seemed fine, solid, perfectly ordinary. That night, I made a fire in the stove. The logs cracked and hissed as they burned, filling the room with warmth and a soft, orange glow. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and shaking the porch boards. I lay on the sofa, listening to the creaks and groans of the cabin as it settled, the smell of burning wood in the air. I told myself I was being paranoid, that everything was fine, but my stomach twisted whenever the wind howled. I was alone, miles from anyone, with nothing but the forest surrounding me. Around midnight, I woke to a noise, a soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground outside. My heart jumped, and I froze, listening. The sound stopped as abruptly as it started. I told myself it was probably a branch or a deer, but I couldn't shake the unease. I got up and peeked through the window. The forest was black, the clearing barely visible in the weak light of the moon. Nothing moved. I shook my head and went back to the sofa, telling myself I needed sleep. The next morning, I decided to explore a little. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, and a narrow trail disappeared into the trees. I followed it for a few hundred meters, listening to birds and the occasional rustle of small animals. The trail was overgrown in places, the ground soft and uneven. I noticed footprints, human, I realized after a moment, heading deeper into the forest. They were old, perhaps a day or two, but distinct. My heart rate increased. Who else had been here? I followed them for a short distance, then decided it wasn't a good idea to wander too far. I didn't want to get lost in the middle of the forest. By evening, the wind had picked up again. I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the shadows stretch across the clearing. I felt watched, not by anyone specific, not consciously, but a constant, low pressure in the back of my mind. I kept imagining someone moving between the trees, glimpses of shadows that disappeared when I looked directly at them. I shook my head. I was alone. This was ridiculous. The next night, the noise returned. This time it was closer. A scraping sound, like metal against stone, coming from the side of the cabin. My chest tightened. I grabbed a flashlight and moved carefully to the side door. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the wet ground and fallen leaves. I waited, holding my breath, listening. The sound stopped, then started again, this time coming from the back of the cabin. My stomach dropped. Someone, or something, was moving around my cabin. I considered calling the police, but the cell signal was non-existent. I had no way to reach anyone. I went inside, locked the doors, and tried to calm myself. I checked all the windows, made sure the stove was cold enough not to cause any problems, and sat with a baseball bat I had found in the corner. The scraping continued sporadically throughout the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined a figure moving just outside the walls. Every time I heard it, my body tensed, my hands gripping the bat until my knuckles hurt. By the third day, I was running low on food. I had brought supplies, but not much. I decided I needed to hike into town, a few miles away, to get more. I packed a small backpack, left a note in the cabin, and set off on the trail. The forest was eerily quiet. Even the birds had gone silent. I followed the trail carefully, keeping an eye on every shadow, every movement. About halfway to the road, I heard a twig snap behind me. I froze. The sound was deliberate, not random. Someone was following me. I broke into a run, my legs burning, my heart hammering, until I reached the dirt road. I walked briskly along it until I found a house with lights on. I asked for directions and bought some supplies. I didn't tell anyone where I had been. I couldn't. Returning to the cabin, I was more cautious. I set up improvised alarms, tin cans on strings, around the clearing so any movement would make a sound. I reinforced the locks on the doors and windows, even though they were already sturdy. I stayed inside, watching the forest, listening. The scraping sound came less frequently, but it never fully stopped. I realized that whoever had been there before, or whoever was still around, was cautious, careful, waiting, observing. I spent the next few days preparing. I cleared a small area around the cabin, making it impossible to approach without being seen. I gathered heavy sticks and stones to defend myself if necessary. I made sure the stove and fireplace were ready to light at a moment's notice. Each night, I sat awake, listening to the forest, flashlight in hand, bat at my side. I stopped thinking of it as a relaxing retreat. It was a survival situation, and I had to treat it as such. One morning, I woke to a new sound. Footsteps outside the cabin, slow and deliberate. My heart froze. I grabbed the bat and flashlight, moving quietly toward the door. The footsteps circled the cabin, never stopping, sometimes pausing, always cautious. Then, abruptly, they stopped. Nothing. I waited, silent, listening to the wind in the trees. Hours passed. No further sound. I knew I couldn't stay. If whoever had been here returned, I had no reinforcements, no way to call for help, and no escape if they were armed. I had to leave soon. That afternoon, I packed quickly and loaded my car. I double-checked every window and door, making sure nothing was broken. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. Shadows moved between the trees, watching. I didn't stop, didn't slow down, not until I reached the main road. I reported the situation to the local authorities once I was safely in town. They took it seriously but said there had been no reports of recent trespassers in the area. I insisted, describing the tracks, the noises, everything. They promised to check the area. I never returned to that cabin, and I never rented another one that was completely isolated. The experience stayed with me for years. The fear wasn't from ghosts or fairy tales. It was real people, real danger, real isolation. The kind of fear that comes from knowing someone could be right outside your window, hiding, waiting, while you are completely alone. I realized later that the isolation itself amplified every sound, every shadow, and every instinct. It taught me to respect solitude and to prepare for anything. It taught me that the forest can be beautiful and deadly at the same time. And most importantly, it taught me to leave when the warning signs are there, to trust instinct, and to act before fear becomes panic. I survived because I stayed alert, because I didn't assume safety, and because I never let the forest close in on me without a plan. The cabin is still there, deep in the trees, empty now, waiting. But I will never go back, and I will never forget the long nights of scraping sounds and shadows just beyond the light. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend alone in the cabin for months. The last few weeks at work had left me drained, and the thought of being in the woods, far from the city and its constant noise, was the only thing keeping me going. The cabin wasn't far from the main road, maybe a 20-minute drive down a winding gravel path lined with dense pines. It had a small clearing around it, and beyond that, the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. I remembered the owner telling me over the phone that the cabin was fully furnished, had electricity, and even a wood stove. Sounded perfect. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun low but still hanging in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. The gravel crunched under my tires, and I slowed as I approached the clearing, my nerves buzzing a little with anticipation. The cabin was small, rustic but solid, built of dark-stained wood. The windows were dusty but intact, reflecting the amber light of the late sun. I parked, grabbed my backpack, and stepped onto the porch. The air smelled of wet pine and earth. There was a chill in the air, not unpleasant, just enough to remind me that autumn was arriving fast. The cabin door opened with a creak that made me pause for a second, just listening. Inside, it was dim, the sunlight filtering through dusty curtains. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I walked through the small living area. The furniture was simple. A small sofa, a wooden table, and a couple of chairs. The kitchen was compact but functional, and the stove looked like it had been used recently, which was comforting. The bedroom was tiny but cozy, with a bed, a small dresser, and a window facing the clearing. I unpacked slowly, arranging my things carefully. There was a strange satisfaction in laying out my clothes, stacking my books neatly, and filling the small fridge with snacks I had brought along. I made a mental note to gather firewood before sunset so I could light the stove. I liked to feel organized, especially when I was alone in a place like this. By the time I finished, the sun was dipping behind the trees, and shadows spread across the clearing like liquid. I went outside with my flashlight and started collecting wood. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, and I noticed that the usual sounds of birds or rustling small animals were missing. It was that eerie silence that made the air feel heavier. I tried to shake it off. Maybe animals were hiding, I thought. Maybe they sensed me, an intruder in their territory. By the time I had a small stack of logs beside the stove, the sky had turned deep purple, and the first stars were peeking through the branches. I lit the fire slowly, watching the flames lick at the wood, casting flickering shadows against the walls. The warmth was immediate and comforting, and I felt the tension of the day start to leave my shoulders. I had brought a notebook, and I decided to sit by the fire and write down my plans for the weekend. Maybe sketch a little. The fire crackled, the only sound in the otherwise still cabin. After a few hours, I felt hungry, so I heated some canned soup and ate quietly, enjoying the taste more than I usually did. When I finished, I washed the dishes and returned to the fire. Night had fully arrived, and the forest beyond the clearing was a wall of black. I pulled a blanket around my shoulders, feeling the warmth of the fire against my skin. Then I noticed it, a faint sound outside, almost like a footstep in the leaves. I froze. It was subtle at first, almost dismissible, but then I heard it again, closer this time. I told myself it must be an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but the sound was heavier, deliberate, and it seemed to move around the perimeter of the clearing. My heart began to beat faster. I put on the small jacket I had draped over the chair and grabbed a flashlight. Slowly, I approached the window, peeking through the dusty glass into the darkness. There was nothing. The clearing was empty, and the trees swayed gently in the night breeze. My rational mind tried to reassure me. "It's nothing," I told myself. "Probably a deer. They can be heavy on their feet when moving through the brush." Still, the sound lingered in my mind, sharp and insistent. I walked to the door and quietly opened it, stepping onto the porch. The night was cold, and the forest pressed against the clearing like a solid wall. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the trees and the ground, but the beam caught only shadows. My nerves were on edge now, every small crackle of a branch making me jump. I forced myself to take deep breaths. I was alone, yes, but I had locks on the door and windows, and the cabin was solid. Still, the feeling of being watched, of someone or something just beyond the light, gnawed at me. I returned inside, bolting the door behind me, and tried to focus on mundane things. Checking the stove, refilling the fire, organizing my notebook. Time passed, slow and heavy. Then I heard it again, this time not outside the cabin, but closer, near the walls. Something was moving around the perimeter. My stomach sank. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios. Could someone have followed me here? Was this a break-in attempt? I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a cast iron pan from the kitchen, and crept toward the bedroom. The footsteps were sporadic now, sometimes stopping entirely, as if whoever or whatever it was testing me. I tried not to make a sound, holding my breath as the movements continued. My phone was in my pocket, but the signal was weak. I realized then that if I had to call for help, it would take time for someone to reach me. The forest was remote. Isolation was supposed to be peaceful. Now it was terrifying. I had been driving for hours along winding, narrow roads that cut through dense forest. The GPS on my phone kept flickering between strong and weak signal, and at some point, I realized it might be better not to rely on it at all. I was heading to a cabin I had rented for a week, isolated and far from any town. The photos online had made it look perfect. Wooden, sturdy, with a porch that overlooked a small clearing surrounded by trees. I wanted peace, quiet, a chance to think. Work had been eating at me, and I had grown tired of the noise of the city, the endless chatter and the constant light. I needed silence, and I was willing to drive hours to get it. As the sun started dipping behind the trees, the road became narrower and more rugged. Gravel turned to dirt, and the tire tracks of previous vehicles were faint, half erased by recent rain. I slowed my car to a crawl, gripping the wheel tightly, listening to the crunch of loose stones beneath the tires. There was no one around for miles. I had not seen another car for over an hour. The forest pressed in on either side, dark and silent, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind made me flinch. It was one of those places where every little sound felt amplified. The snap of a branch, the distant caw of a crow, the thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. Finally, I saw it. The cabin was modest, made of dark-stained wood, and perched slightly above the ground. A small porch ran along the front, and the windows reflected the fading light like dark eyes. A thin plume of smoke rose lazily from the chimney, even though it wasn't cold enough for a fire yet. The gravel driveway ended abruptly in a small clearing, the forest pressing close around it. I parked, turned off the engine, and listened. Silence almost absolute, the kind of silence that made the wind sound loud. I took a deep breath and stepped out, the air immediately colder than I expected, carrying the damp smell of wet leaves and earth. The cabin door was unlocked, which surprised me. I pushed it open, and the smell of wood and dust hit me immediately. Inside, the place was rustic but well kept. A small living area with a sofa, a wood-burning stove, and a dining table filled the main room. A narrow hallway led to a couple of bedrooms and a bathroom. Sunlight filtered through the windows, and the shadows stretched long across the wooden floors. I dropped my bag, letting out a slow breath I didn't realize I had been holding. This was exactly what I had imagined. Empty, quiet, and completely alone. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to look at the cabin more closely. The walls had small, shallow scratches, maybe from animals, maybe just marks from years of use. There was a stack of firewood near the stove and a small pile of newspapers in one corner, yellowed with age. The kitchen was tiny, but it had everything I would need: pots, pans, a small fridge, a gas stove. I ran water in the sink. Clear, cold, slightly metallic, but otherwise normal. The cabin seemed fine, solid, perfectly ordinary. That night, I made a fire in the stove. The logs cracked and hissed as they burned, filling the room with warmth and a soft, orange glow. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and shaking the porch boards. I lay on the sofa, listening to the creaks and groans of the cabin as it settled, the smell of burning wood in the air. I told myself I was being paranoid, that everything was fine, but my stomach twisted whenever the wind howled. I was alone, miles from anyone, with nothing but the forest surrounding me. Around midnight, I woke to a noise, a soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground outside. My heart jumped, and I froze, listening. The sound stopped as abruptly as it started. I told myself it was probably a branch or a deer, but I couldn't shake the unease. I got up and peeked through the window. The forest was black, the clearing barely visible in the weak light of the moon. Nothing moved. I shook my head and went back to the sofa, telling myself I needed sleep. The next morning, I decided to explore a little. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, and a narrow trail disappeared into the trees. I followed it for a few hundred meters, listening to birds and the occasional rustle of small animals. The trail was overgrown in places, the ground soft and uneven. I noticed footprints, human, I realized after a moment, heading deeper into the forest. They were old, perhaps a day or two, but distinct. My heart rate increased. Who else had been here? I followed them for a short distance, then decided it wasn't a good idea to wander too far. I didn't want to get lost in the middle of the forest. By evening, the wind had picked up again. I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the shadows stretch across the clearing. I felt watched, not by anyone specific, not consciously, but a constant, low pressure in the back of my mind. I kept imagining someone moving between the trees, glimpses of shadows that disappeared when I looked directly at them. I shook my head. I was alone. This was ridiculous. The next night, the noise returned. This time, it was closer. A scraping sound, like metal against stone, coming from the side of the cabin. My chest tightened. I grabbed a flashlight and moved carefully to the side door. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the wet ground and fallen leaves. I waited, holding my breath, listening. The sound stopped, then started again, this time coming from the back of the cabin. My stomach dropped. Someone, or something, was moving around my cabin. I considered calling the police, but the cell signal was non-existent. I had no way to reach anyone. The evening was tense. I kept the fire burning brightly, but every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch made me jump. Around midnight, the sounds of movement returned, but this time they were closer, unmistakably close. Something, or someone, was walking around the cabin. I held my breath, gripping the axe tightly. I watched the shadows dance across the walls. The footsteps stopped at one point, right outside the window I was sitting near. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would wake the forest. I forced myself to calm down. If someone was here, they had to have noticed me. I considered my options. Hide, confront, escape. The cabin doors were sturdy, but if someone wanted in badly enough, I couldn't guarantee I could stop them. I decided the safest course was to wait until first light. Morning came, gray and damp, with a mist clinging to the trees. The movement outside had stopped during the night, but I was wary. I lit the stove and made coffee, trying to calm my nerves. I decided to pack essentials and leave, But before I could act, I noticed the footprints again, fresh this time, around the cabin, leading to the woods. They weren't large, but they were deliberate. Whoever had been there had circled the cabin, observing. I realized then that the situation was serious. This wasn't a casual hiker or a hunter. Someone had been watching me. I didn't leave immediately. I waited until the fog lifted and visibility improved. I packed food, water, and my gear, and I planned my route carefully. The dirt road I had driven in on was too obvious, and I didn't want to be followed. Instead, I aimed for a narrow game trail I had noticed a few hundred meters from the cabin. It led downhill toward a larger creek, which I hoped would intersect with a road eventually. The trek was grueling. The underbrush tore at my clothes, and the terrain was uneven. I stumbled multiple times, cutting myself on branches, scraping my hands on rocks. Each sound I made seemed amplified in the forest, and I was sure anyone following me would hear it. I moved as silently as possible, taking breaks behind large trees, listening intently. The forest felt alive with potential danger. Around mid-afternoon, I reached the creek I had hoped would guide me. I followed it, carefully stepping on rocks to keep my feet dry. After an hour, I heard a faint engine sound in the distance. Relief surged through me. I picked up my pace, moving quickly along the bank until I emerged onto a small dirt road. Moments later, a car appeared, an older man in a truck. I waved frantically and he stopped. I explained as best I could, pantomiming the cabin, the footprints, and my fear. He listened, nodded, and offered a ride to the nearest town. The sense of relief was overwhelming as I drove away from the cabin. I didn't look back until we were miles down the road. The forest stretched endlessly, and I realized how vulnerable I had been, alone and exposed, in a place where no one could reach me quickly. I knew I would never return to that cabin. The memories of the footsteps, the circling, the long nights spent awake with nothing but fear, would stay with me for a long time. Back in town, I contacted the local authorities. They visited the cabin and found signs that someone had indeed been living nearby for weeks. A small makeshift shelter, discarded food containers, and signs of a fire pit used regularly. They assured me that no one had been apprehended, but they advised me to never attempt such isolation alone again. The police report made it official. What I had experienced was real, and the threat had been genuine. In the end, I returned home, exhausted but alive. The cabin trip had been meant to bring peace, but instead, it had shown me how quickly safety can vanish in isolation. I learned to respect the forest, the silence, and the unknown. I never forgot the sound of deliberate footsteps circling a quiet cabin in the night, and I never again took solitude for granted. Even now, years later, I think back to that cabin. I remember the smell of wet wood, the creak of the floorboards, the soft murmur of the creek. But above all, I remember the fear, real, human, unrelenting fear, and the relief of survival. The cabin taught me something I would never forget. Being alone in the wilderness can be peaceful, but it can also be dangerous in ways that are subtle, patient, and completely human. I had been planning this cabin trip for months. The weeks leading up to it had been exhausting, work piling up, people needing favors, and the constant noise of the city wearing me down. I needed a break, something real, something away from everyone and everything. I wanted silence, isolation, and space to think. I found a small cabin deep in the woods, off the beaten path, far from roads and cell towers. The photos online were appealing. A modest wooden structure with a small porch, nestled against a clearing, surrounded by dense forest. The description said it had a wood stove, basic kitchen amenities, and a creek running nearby. Perfect. I booked it for a long weekend, thinking it would be peaceful, restorative. The drive there was longer than I expected. The first few hours were on paved roads, passing through small towns that gradually disappeared as I followed a twisting, narrow forest road. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to close in, until sunlight barely reached the ground. By the time I turned onto the final dirt path that led directly to the cabin, I had passed no other vehicles for nearly an hour. The road was uneven, littered with potholes, roots, and fallen branches. My car bounced over every bump, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly, aware that any sudden misstep could mean getting stuck miles from help. Finally, the cabin appeared through the trees. Even though it was a simple structure, it looked sturdier than I expected. The wood was weathered, but solid. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and the roof had a few missing shingles, but overall it seemed safe. There was a small fire pit just off to the side, with some charred logs already in it, suggesting someone had been there not too long ago. The creek was indeed close by, a thin ribbon of water glinting in the sunlight as it moved over rocks. I parked the car and stepped out. The air was immediately different, cooler, fresher, almost electric with the energy of isolation. I grabbed my backpack and went inside. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. The furniture was sparse. A small table with 2 chairs, a couple of beds with thin mattresses, and a few shelves holding basic kitchenware. There were no electronics, no television, just the essentials. Exactly what I wanted. I dropped my bag, took a deep breath, and started unpacking. The first night was uneventful. I built a fire in the wood stove, prepared a simple meal, and settled into one of the beds. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and the creek murmured softly. I felt the kind of quiet that only comes when there is no human activity for miles. It was unnerving at first, but it gradually became soothing. I fell asleep to the sound of the water and the occasional cracking of the fire. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I followed a narrow path that led along the creek. The woods were dense, almost claustrophobic, but beautiful. Birds flitted through the branches, and I saw small animals dart across the path. Squirrels, rabbits, a fox. I walked for hours, mapping out the area in my mind, noting landmarks like fallen trees, unusual rocks, and clusters of berry bushes. By midday, I returned to the cabin, tired but exhilarated. That night, I prepared a more substantial fire, laying the logs carefully to ensure it would last. The sound of the creek, combined with the occasional rustling in the forest, created a rhythm that felt almost hypnotic. But as the night deepened, I began to notice sounds that didn't quite fit. There were snaps of twigs, faint but deliberate, coming from different directions. At first, I convinced myself it was animals. Deer, raccoons, maybe a bear moving through the underbrush. But the sounds were too consistent, too close, and they didn't move in the natural, random way animals do. They were methodical. I tried to shake off the unease. I checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked, and piled more logs onto the fire. The heat helped, but the tension in my chest didn't ease. I sat by the fire, listening. Occasionally, I thought I heard a low groan, but it was always mixed with the wind and the creek, so I couldn't be sure. I resolved to sleep with the door locked and the axe I had brought lying across my legs, just in case. The next day, I realized something important. I had brought enough food for a few days, but not for an emergency. I also had a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and extra batteries. My phone had no signal, and there was no other way to contact anyone if something went wrong. The cabin felt even more isolated now that I considered how cut off I really was. The trail I had walked yesterday could serve as an escape route, but it was slow and overgrown, and if someone or something was following me, it wouldn't be an easy retreat. That afternoon, I went for another walk, this time taking a different path that led slightly uphill. I wanted to get a better view of the surrounding forest. After about an hour, I reached a ridge that overlooked a small valley. The trees stretched endlessly, a sea of green and brown, with the creek winding through it like a silver ribbon. I paused, taking it all in, feeling small in the vastness of it. That's when I noticed something unusual. Footprints along the edge of the ridge, heading parallel to the path I had taken. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either, and the pattern didn't match any animal I recognized. The prints were human, clearly made by a boot. My stomach sank. If someone had been here, how long ago? Did they know the cabin was occupied? Were they still nearby? I followed the prints cautiously for a few minutes before they veered into thicker trees and disappeared. I decided it was probably a hiker or hunter, and maybe I was overreacting. Still, I returned to the cabin quickly, my pace faster than usual. I never thought I would find myself in that cabin, deep in the middle of nowhere, so alone and unprepared, with the kind of fear that doesn't come from stories or movies, but from real, living things. I had driven for hours through winding dirt roads and thick forest, the kind where trees crowd together so tightly that the sunlight never really hits the ground. I was looking for solitude, away from everything, a place to think and rest. I wanted a cabin where I could disconnect, have a few days to myself, and just breathe. What I didn't realize was how easy it was to lose your sense of safety when everything you know about the world, the familiar sounds of civilization, the light from street lamps, the occasional car passing by, disappears completely. The cabin itself looked like it had been there forever. It was small, wooden, and had a weathered look, with dark stains from rain and moss growing along the edges of the roof. The windows were dusty, the wood groaned under my touch, and the door was heavy but surprisingly functional. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and something faintly sour, like mold or rot in the corners. The floor creaked with every step. The cabin was sparsely furnished. A small kitchen with a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and some shelves that held a few dusty plates and pans. I told myself it was perfect, exactly what I had been looking for, even though I could feel a weight pressing on me as I set down my bag. First, everything seemed normal. I unpacked my things, set up my sleeping bag, and decided to explore the surrounding area. The forest outside was thick, the ground covered in leaves and twigs, the air humid and heavy. Birds chirped, and the occasional squirrel darted across the path. But as I walked further away from the cabin, I began to notice how quiet it actually was. Not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful, but the kind that feels like absence. There were no distant engines, no planes overhead, no hum of civilization. Even the birds seemed cautious, disappearing as I approached. When I returned to the cabin, I realized how small it actually was in the middle of all that wilderness. The sun was beginning to set, and the shadows from the trees stretched long and dark across the ground. I lit the wood stove, filled a kettle with water, and sat by the fire as the temperature dropped. It was supposed to be relaxing, and for a while it was, but then I heard it, a rustling sound from outside. I froze, straining to hear it over the crackling of the fire. It could have been anything, I told myself. An animal, a branch falling, the wind, but the sound was deliberate, like someone moving slowly through the underbrush, careful not to make noise. I tried to ignore it, but it persisted. Every now and then, there would be a snap, a crunch, and then silence. I checked the windows, but the grime and darkness outside made it impossible to see clearly. I considered going outside to confront it, to see what it was, but something in me refused to move. The forest around me didn't feel safe anymore. The way the trees pressed close together, the way the shadows bent unnaturally in the corners of my vision. It was like the world had narrowed to just the cabin and the forest pressing in around me. I stayed inside, doors locked, curtains drawn, listening to the intermittent rustling. Hours passed. I tried to focus on mundane things, checking my supplies, tidying up, but the noises outside never stopped completely. Occasionally, I would catch movement just beyond the window, a shape that melted away when I looked directly at it. The forest was alive in a way I hadn't expected. Not with birds or squirrels, but with something patient, slow, and watching. I kept imagining scenarios, each worse than the last. Was it a bear? A human? Something I didn't know how to classify? The logical part of my brain insisted it was a deer or a fox, but my instincts screamed that it was something far more deliberate. Night came fully, and with it, a deep darkness that the cabin couldn't penetrate. I used a flashlight to check the perimeter, moving carefully so as not to make noise. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating the trunks, the leaves, and the uneven ground, but nothing else. No footprints, no glint of eyes, nothing that confirmed the source of the sound. Yet the rustling continued, and now it had a rhythm, a slow pattern that didn't match the movement of animals I knew. It was deliberate. By the time I returned inside, I felt the first real wave of panic. The cabin, once my sanctuary, felt exposed, vulnerable. Couldn't sleep. Every crack of the wood, every groan of the old building, made my heart jump. I sat by the stove, rubbing my hands together to keep warm, staring at the windows. My mind raced. I considered calling for help, but there was no signal. My phone showed one bar, then nothing. The isolation that had drawn me here now became suffocating. Around 2 a.m., the sound changed. Instead of the slow rustling, it became sharper, closer. The snap of a branch, the crunch of leaves, like someone or something was moving along the edge of the clearing. My first thought was to hide, to barricade myself inside the cabin. I pushed the chairs against the door, piled my bag and any heavy items I could find against it. I felt ridiculous, but it gave me a momentary sense of control. Hours passed in that tense, frozen state. I didn't dare move or make a sound. The forest outside seemed to shift with every faint breeze, the shadows dancing just beyond the edges of the light. Occasionally, I would hear something behind me, a soft thump against the wall or the floor. I realized that I wasn't imagining it. The cabin itself was reacting to my fear. The floorboards were warped, the walls thin. Every small sound was amplified. I had been looking forward to a weekend in the cabin for months. Life had become a routine of work, bills, and constant noise, and I craved silence. The cabin was tucked deep in the forest, far from the nearest road, and the maps marked the trails leading there with warnings about rough terrain. I didn't care. I wanted isolation, a place where I could walk among the trees, hear nothing but birds, wind, and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. The idea of being completely alone, disconnected from the world, felt freeing. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. The drive had been long, slow, and jarring, winding over gravel roads that rattled my car and left a fine dust coating everything. The last stretch had been a narrow dirt track, bordered by dense woods, barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass. As I drove, the shadows lengthened. I noticed that the forest was unnaturally quiet. No birds called out, no insects buzzed. Just the soft sound of the wind in the trees and my own tires crunching over the gravel. The cabin itself was small, simple, and old, with rough-hewn logs and a steep roof. The windows were dusty, and the front door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the smell of wood, old furniture, and a faint, sour scent from disuse hit me. It was dim, the late afternoon light barely penetrating through the dirty glass. There was a small kitchen with a wood stove, a table with a couple of chairs, and a single bedroom upstairs. The furniture was worn, the bed covered with a thin, faded blanket. Dust motes floated in the shafts of light coming through the windows. I set my backpack down and ran my fingers over the old wood of the table. I spent the first hour unpacking and inspecting the cabin. I checked the stove, the water supply, and even the outhouse outside. Everything seemed serviceable. The forest beyond the cabin looked endless. The trees were tall, their trunks dark and gnarled, the underbrush thick with dead leaves and fallen branches. I could see a faint path leading down toward a small creek, but it was narrow, barely more than a trail. By the time I settled, the sun had dropped below the horizon, and darkness began to creep in. I lit a few candles in the cabin, though they did little to cut the shadows that filled the corners. I had brought a lantern, but I decided to save it for later. I made a simple dinner, canned beans heated over the stove, and ate slowly, listening to the strange, subtle sounds of the forest. First, it was just the wind. Then I heard something else. A snap of a branch, small but deliberate. I froze, listening. Another snap, closer this time, coming from the side of the cabin. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was probably a deer or a fox. The forest was full of animals, but the sound unsettled me. Every time I thought I had heard it, a new sound followed, a rustle, a crack, the low brush of movement through the trees. I went to the window and peered outside. The forest was dark, the shapes of the trees black against the night sky. My eyes strained, but I saw nothing moving. Still, the feeling of being watched crawled over my skin. I decided to go to bed early. The stairs to the bedroom creaked loudly under my weight. The bed was hard, the blanket thin, and I lay there listening to the night. The forest outside was alive with sound now. Branches breaking, leaves rustling, something heavy moving over the ground. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but my mind would not accept it. I felt my pulse thumping in my ears, every small noise magnified in the stillness. Around midnight, I woke to a new sound, a soft, scraping noise coming from the front of the cabin. My stomach twisted. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. The sound continued, slow and methodical, moving around the cabin. Something or someone was circling the building. I wanted to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bear, but the careful, deliberate motion sounded too intentional. My chest tightened with fear. I considered calling for help, but there was no cell service here, none at all. I was truly isolated. Hours passed in that state of tense waiting. Every snap of a branch, every scuffing sound outside made my heart leap. I tried to stay quiet, but sleep refused me. When the first hint of light came through the window, I went downstairs to check the perimeter. The front door was locked, but there were faint marks in the dirt around the cabin. Footprints too large to be human in some places, and in others the impressions looked strangely shaped, as if someone had been careful to make them hard to identify. My stomach sank. Whoever or whatever had been circling the cabin had left traces. I considered leaving immediately, but the dirt road was long and rough, and the thought of moving through the forest with the same creature stalking me made me hesitate. I spent the next day inspecting the surrounding area. I followed the creek a little way, noting how easily someone could approach the cabin unseen through the trees. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen, feeling the tension in my body grow. By nightfall, I had fortified the cabin as best I could. I moved furniture against the windows, placed heavy objects near doors, and kept the lantern close at hand. But as darkness fell, the same noises returned. Soft scraping, the crack of branches, the occasional thump as something large moved just beyond my line of sight. Started as an ordinary trip, one I had planned for months. I had been craving solitude for a long time, away from the constant noise of the city, from the people I could never quite escape. I rented a small cabin far out in the woods, a place that was remote enough that cell service barely worked, and no one could hear you if you called for help. I had convinced myself that the isolation would be peaceful, restorative, the perfect escape to recharge and think. I packed what I thought I needed: food, water, extra clothes, blankets, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and enough batteries to last a week. I had checked the weather several times, noting that a cold front would come through midweek. I had no idea how wrong my assumptions would be. The drive to the cabin was long, winding through narrow roads flanked by dense trees, the kind of trees that seemed too tall and too old, their branches twisting in ways that looked unnatural even in daylight. I passed no houses for miles, no other cars, not a single person. The silence of the forest pressed against me through the windows of my car, a weight I didn't notice at first because the city noise was still buzzing in my ears. I remember the way the light started to change as I got closer to the cabin. The sun dipped lower, making the forest seem darker, the shadows longer and more defined. I arrived at the cabin just as the last of the sunlight vanished. The cabin was small, made of dark wood, with a narrow porch that creaked when I stepped on it. I parked my car on the gravel path, the crunch echoing through the emptiness. My first impression was that it was perfect. Simple, rustic, sturdy. It smelled of wood and dust, a dry, musty smell that made me cough a little. I set my things down and began exploring. The interior was simple. A small living area with a worn couch, a table, a tiny kitchen, and a wood-burning stove. A narrow hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. Nothing fancy, nothing modern, but it had exactly what I needed. Walls, a roof, a lockable door. The first night was quiet, almost unbearably so. I sat by the window, listening to the wind brushing through the trees. There were sounds I wasn't used to. The occasional snap of a branch, the low groan of the trees as they swayed, the rustling of leaves. I knew animals were out there, and at first it was comforting, a reminder that the forest was alive. But as the night deepened, the sounds became sharper, closer. I could hear something moving around the cabin, not running or hopping, but sliding, almost deliberate. I tried to convince myself it was just a raccoon or some deer, but the way the noise moved, as if it was inspecting the perimeter, unsettled me. I checked the doors and windows, all locked. I even bolted the main door. Still, sleep did not come easily. The next morning, I tried to calm myself. I went for a short walk, exploring the trail that led down the hill from the cabin. The forest seemed peaceful in daylight, but I noticed signs of something unusual. Trampled grass, broken twigs, and scratch marks on the bark of some of the trees near the cabin. I told myself I had arrived in late fall, that animals were preparing for winter, that everything I saw had a simple explanation. But as I walked further, I found deeper tracks in the mud, human-like, but too large to be mine, too spaced out to belong to any animal I could identify. My heart started to race. I checked my phone, hoping for a signal, but there was none. I made a mental note to stay inside the cabin that night. The following day, I tried to keep busy. I chopped wood for the stove, cleaned the cabin, organized my supplies, and even made a small fire for warmth. The wind had picked up, stronger now, carrying a damp chill that seeped into the cabin despite the stove. Around midday, I noticed that some of my food outside, bags of dry goods I had set near the porch, had been disturbed. Nothing was missing, but they were shifted, moved slightly as if someone or something had touched them and then left. I began checking the windows and doors more carefully, securing them as best I could. Every sound outside made me tense. The rustle of leaves, a snap of a branch, the distant howl of an animal that didn't sound like any I recognized. By the third night, fear had fully set in. The isolation I had longed for now felt like a trap. I couldn't see anyone around, but I knew I wasn't completely alone. Something had been moving near the cabin, something human-sized. I didn't want to accept that there could be a person, but the tracks and the subtle disturbances made it impossible to ignore. I went to sleep with a knife on my bedside table and the flashlight on the floor by my bed. Every creak in the cabin made me jump. I didn't close my eyes until the early hours, when exhaustion finally overcame my terror. The fourth day brought worse realization. I had left a window slightly open to air out the cabin while I chopped wood. When I returned, I noticed it had been fully opened, and the latch was broken. That meant someone had been inside while I was away. I ran through the cabin, checking every corner, every closet. Nothing else had been touched, or at least nothing seemed missing, but my supplies were shifted more than before. Panic started to set in fully. I considered leaving immediately, driving back down the winding road, but the forest was thick, and the roads could be dangerous if I wasn't careful. Besides, the thought of leaving the cabin for a stranger lurking outside terrified me. I spent the next day and night barricading what I could. I moved furniture against the doors, nailed boards over the weakest windows, and even set up a makeshift alarm by tying cans together on strings near the doors. The noises outside escalated. There was movement at all hours now, scratching, rustling, something heavy moving in the brush. It was deliberate. I couldn't see the shape through the trees, but I knew someone, or something, was waiting, watching, testing my defenses. On the fifth day, the tension reached a peak. I stayed inside the cabin, only peeking through cracks in the boards to watch shadows shift between the trees. They were patient, careful, never rushing. It was almost as if they were studying me, learning my routines. I knew I couldn't last much longer like this, trapped in a cabin with no way to call for help, and a stranger or strangers camped just outside. I had to find a way out. I stayed silent, waiting for a long time. The noises stopped as abruptly as they had started. When I finally dared to move, I checked the doors and windows. Nothing seemed disturbed, but I knew someone had been outside. I realized I had two options: wait in terror until morning or attempt to escape immediately. I decided that morning I would leave, even if it meant hiking through the forest to reach my car. I could not remain in that cabin another night with the uncertainty of someone watching me so closely. Morning came, pale and gray. I moved quickly, packing what I could carry. I decided not to leave immediately. I needed to ensure no one was near. I peered out the windows. The forest was empty. footprints were partially obscured by overnight rain, but I could see the faint trail leading from the treeline toward the cabin and then disappearing again. Whoever it was, they hadn't entered. Relief and anxiety mingled. I packed the last items, locked the cabin, and walked briskly toward the car, senses alert for any sound. The forest was quiet, unnaturally quiet, every twig snap making me jump. I reached the car, locked the doors behind me, and drove away slowly, glancing into the rearview mirror at the treeline. The drive back was tense. Every shadow along the road made me flinch, but eventually the forest gave way to small towns and finally to the highway. By the time I reached the city, exhaustion and adrenaline had drained me. I returned to my apartment and collapsed into my bed, overwhelmed with relief. The memory of the cabin lingered, a stark reminder of how quickly solitude could turn into fear when you are entirely vulnerable. I realized then that preparation and rational caution only go so far. Sometimes, isolation itself is enough to make the mind see threats where there may be none, and sometimes there truly are threats, hidden, patient, and close. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I replayed the experience repeatedly, examining every sound, every shadow, every rustle of leaves. I told myself I had escaped unharmed, that was the point, that I had survived. And yet, part of me knew I had been lucky. Lucky to leave before confrontation. Lucky that the person outside never entered. I never returned to that cabin. I never even tried to find another remote retreat. The fear had planted itself firmly, a lesson about isolation, vulnerability, and the fragile boundary between safety and danger. I realized the true scar of that experience wasn't just fear, but awareness. Awareness that even in the quietest, most secluded place, the world can intrude, uninvited, and that no amount of preparation can entirely erase the possibility of danger. And in that, there was clarity. I had survived, I had learned, and I would never take solitude lightly again. I had been driving for hours on narrow, winding mountain roads, the kind that cling to steep slopes with only a thin guardrail separating you from a sheer drop. The sun was just beginning to fade behind the peaks, leaving streaks of orange and purple across the sky. I had been planning this weekend for months, a small escape from the city's noise and chaos. The cabin I rented was far out of cell service, which was exactly what I wanted. A place to be completely alone, surrounded by the quiet of the forest. The last few miles were rough, gravel and dirt, with deep ruts cut into the ground from tire tracks and erosion. The forest grew denser as I drove, the trees casting long shadows across the road. I could feel my tension rising with every turn and bump. I had checked the map several times before I left, but the roads on the GPS began to fade into a blur of forest lines and unmarked paths. I had hoped that my small rented cabin, which was supposed to be tucked away at the end of a long trail, would be easy to find once I turned off the main forest road. I was wrong. When I finally spotted the faint outline of the cabin through the trees, relief washed over me. It was small, made entirely of dark, weathered logs, and seemed almost swallowed by the forest around it. Smoke curled lazily from a chimney, and I realized that someone had been there recently, or maybe the caretaker had left a fire going. The gravel driveway was uneven, and my car shuddered as I drove up to the cabin and parked near the front door. I grabbed my backpack and carefully climbed out, the cold mountain air biting at my skin. The forest around me was almost eerily silent. No birds, no rustling animals, just the soft hiss of the wind through the trees. The cabin looked solid enough, though it clearly had not been lived in for more than a few weeks at a time. The windows were dusty, and the wood creaked slightly as the wind shifted. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell. Wood, smoke, and something else I could not identify at first. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but there was a musty undertone that made the back of my throat tighten. The cabin was small, with a single room that served as both living area and kitchen. A narrow staircase led up to a loft where the bedroom was. I dropped my bag near the door, ran my hands along the walls, and tried to shake off the unease I felt. I spent the next hour settling in. I built a small fire in the stone fireplace, unpacked my supplies, and started exploring the cabin. The kitchen had old appliances, a fridge that still worked, and cupboards stocked with some basic necessities. Canned food, a few boxes of pasta, jars of spices. There was a single bathroom, and the loft had a small bed with a mattress that looked decent enough. Everything seemed fine at first glance, but the more I looked around, the more I noticed subtle details that made my stomach twist. The floorboards creaked under my weight more than they should have, and some of the windows had cracks along the frames. In the corner of the living room, there was a pile of firewood stacked neatly against the wall. Oddly, some of the logs had deep gouges in them, like claws had been dragged across the surface. I told myself it was probably just damage from the caretaker's tools, but my eyes kept returning to the marks. The deeper I looked, the more my mind filled with what-ifs. What if some animal had been here recently? What if something had been living in the cabin without me knowing? I forced myself to brush it off and went upstairs to the loft. The bed was lumpy, but the blankets smelled faintly of cedar and pine, which was at least comforting. I turned off my flashlight and watched the last of the daylight disappear. The forest outside was now a wall of black silhouettes, every branch and trunk moving slightly in the breeze. I could hear the distant call of a bird, or maybe it was an animal, I wasn't sure. The forest was alive, and I was acutely aware that I was completely alone. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every small noise sounded amplified. A branch scraping against the window made me jump. Somewhere outside, I could hear the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, and I kept imagining someone, or something, moving just beyond the edge of the trees. I tried to reason with myself. Bears were common in the area, maybe a deer, maybe just the wind. Still, every sound made me sit up, every shadow made me tense. The next morning, I woke to the sun filtering through the dusty windows. I made coffee on the old stove and ate some canned peaches. The tension from the night before had not completely left me. I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, and the trees towered over me, making me feel small and exposed. I walked along a faint trail that seemed to lead downhill. The soil was damp, and I had to be careful with every step. At one point, I saw paw prints in the mud, large, deep, and unevenly spaced. My heart raced as I recognized the size. They were bigger than a dog's, probably a bear. I made a mental note to be careful and returned to the cabin before the sun got too high. Morning arrived sluggishly. The pale light filtering through the windows revealed nothing unusual. No footprints outside, no indication that anyone or anything had been there. It was almost as if the night had been a hallucination, the product of my fear and isolation. But the tension hadn't left me. I packed my things quickly, unable to stay another night. The forest seemed calm, almost peaceful in the daylight, but I knew better. I drove back down the dirt road, constantly glancing at the trees as I passed. Every shadow seemed to twitch, every rustle in the underbrush made my stomach drop. When I finally reached a paved road and civilization, I felt the tension begin to drain from me. The familiar sights and sounds, the hum of traffic, the distant barking of dogs, the smell of gasoline and asphalt were overwhelming in their normalcy. I realized I had forgotten what it was like to feel safe in the world. Looking back, the experience wasn't about monsters or ghosts. It was about the reality of isolation, of being alone in a space that your mind interprets as hostile simply because it is unknown. There were no supernatural forces, no fantasy elements, just the raw fear of being unprotected, vulnerable, and watched. That fear is primal, hardwired into us. The forest, the cabin, the shadows, they were all neutral, but my mind had turned them into a threat. I never returned to that cabin. I researched the area later, trying to find a rational explanation for the noises I heard. The most likely answer was wild animals, bears, raccoons, or perhaps a human poacher, but the specifics didn't matter. The fear I felt was real, regardless of the source. The experience taught me to respect isolation, to plan carefully when going into remote areas, and to never underestimate the power of solitude. I invested in proper gear, a GPS tracker, and made sure I always had a way to call for help. Eventually, I found other cabins, safer ones, closer to civilization, and I returned to solitude in a controlled way. The fear never left entirely, but it became manageable. I learned to appreciate the quiet without letting it terrify me, to explore without abandoning caution. And I understood something crucial. Being truly alone in the wilderness exposes the fragility of human control. You can prepare as much as possible, but the unknown is always a part of the experience. Respecting it rather than fighting it is what makes survival and sanity possible. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and feel the cold draft that slipped under the cabin door, hear the branches scraping against the windows, and remember the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. But I also remember the lessons, the clarity that comes from facing fear, the focus that comes from knowing your limits, and the relief that comes from finally returning to the light. That cabin, terrifying as it was, changed the way I see the world and the way I see myself. I learned that fear is not always about monsters. Sometimes it's simply about understanding how small and exposed you really are and learning how to live with it. The nights blended into each other. I began to sleep in short bursts, never longer than an hour, waking at every sound. During the day, I explored cautiously, marking my path so I would know if someone or something was following me. I discovered signs of recent human presence in the forest. Footprints, discarded wrappers, and in one place, a small campsite with a fire pit, cold but not long abandoned. Panic settled in. I was not alone. The feeling of being watched was constant. On the third night, the scraping sound returned, closer this time, almost at the door. I had prepared for this. I gripped a heavy metal rod I had found in the shed and waited, muscles tense, every nerve alert. Hours passed. I dared not move. Finally, the dawn broke, and whatever had been circling the cabin retreated into the trees. I knew I could not stay any longer. I packed quickly, leaving nothing behind that could attract attention. I took one last look at the cabin, the place that had promised solitude, but had nearly driven me to panic. The forest was silent, but I knew the danger was real. I followed the dirt track, moving quickly but carefully. Every sound made me flinch. After nearly 3 hours, I reached the main road. A passing car stopped when it saw me, and I gave the driver a trembling wave. When I reached civilization, I called the local authorities. They later confirmed that the area had been used by criminals who sometimes targeted cabins, watching from the forest and waiting for moments of isolation. My cabin, they said, was lucky. Many others were not so fortunate. I felt a chill but also relief. I had survived, intact, and I had learned something essential. True isolation can be dangerous, and even the quietest forest can hide very real threats. I never returned to that cabin. I sold it, closed the chapter, and I never looked back. But even years later, I remember those nights vividly. The scraping outside, the shadows moving just beyond the candlelight, the terror that made me hyper-aware of every sound and movement. I still think about what might have happened if I had panicked or made a mistake. I survived because I stayed calm, because I observed carefully, and because I did not underestimate the danger. That lesson stayed with me. Nature is indifferent, and isolation can bring out the darkest possibilities. Not supernatural, not imagined, but real. Even now, when I walk alone in the woods, I pay attention to every sound, every rustle in the underbrush. I know what it feels like to be truly alone and watched, and I carry that memory with me. I am safer now, cautious, but I also know that fear is not weakness, it is survival. The solution came unexpectedly. I had noticed a narrow service trail behind the cabin, partially hidden by undergrowth. It was overgrown but seemed to lead downhill to a larger forest road. I spent hours preparing quietly, making sure the cabin was secure enough that a break-in would be noticed if they tried while I was gone. I left a small diversion, my old tarp and some scattered food, to draw attention, hoping it would give me a head start. Night fell again, but this time I moved. I slipped out a back window, keeping low, holding the flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. The forest was alive with noises, but I focused on the trail. Every step, every snapped twig made me freeze. I could hear movement behind me, rustling faster now. Panic surged, but I forced myself to keep moving, trying not to trip in the roots and uneven ground. The trail was narrow, and the undergrowth scratched at my arms and legs, but I kept going, counting every step, every tree, until finally the sounds of pursuit faded. By the time I reached the forest road, I was exhausted, soaked with sweat and mud, but the sense of relief was immense. I stayed hidden in the trees for what felt like hours until headlights appeared far down the road. I ran toward them, waving my arms, screaming for help. The car slowed, and the driver stopped, shocked at seeing a wild-looking, mud-covered person emerge from the darkness. I climbed in without hesitation, shaking uncontrollably. I explained nothing. I didn't need to. The way the driver looked at me, the tension still in my body, the raw panic in my voice, told everything. I didn't return to the cabin. Authorities came a few days later to investigate, but by then the tracks were gone. There was no sign of the intruder, nothing except the scratched trees and the displaced supplies. I left my belongings behind, never going back. The cabin, once a symbol of peace, had become a trap, a place where the isolation I sought nearly cost me my life. I spent weeks after that trying to process the fear, the panic, the overwhelming sense of being watched. I realized that isolation is not always peaceful. Sometimes, the forest hides more than beauty. It can hide danger, patience, and intent. And I had been naive to think that a locked door and a few precautions could keep me safe. Now, whenever I think about solitude, I remember that cabin. I remember the weight of silence pressing in, the way the shadows seemed to move on their own, and the slow, creeping realization that someone else was out there, waiting, patient and careful, just as I had been observing them. I learned to respect the forest in a way I never had before, to never assume safety in isolation, and to understand that fear is not an abstract idea. It is real, immediate, and sometimes almost inescapable. I still dream about that cabin sometimes, even years later, not with the fantasy of ghosts or monsters, but with the vivid, stark reality of someone watching you quietly from the shadows, calculating each move, and the terrible, helpless knowledge that if you are caught alone, it may already be too late. I survived, but I carry every sound, every shadow, every detail with me. It taught me that the world can be beautiful, but also quietly cruel, and that the smallest miscalculation in isolation can become a matter of life or death. The experience changed me. I no longer seek complete solitude. I still enjoy the forest, the quiet, the air, but now I go prepared. Not just with supplies, but with a plan, with awareness, with the understanding that danger is sometimes as mundane as a person hiding in the trees, and not always obvious. I left the cabin behind, never looking back, and yet I will never forget the fear, the vigilance, and the ultimate relief of escape. That relief, after days of quiet terror, was unlike anything else in my life. It was clear, detailed, lasting, and earned. I had always loved the isolation of the woods, the way the trees rose like silent sentinels, the way the wind whispered through the branches, and the smell of damp earth after rain. It all made me feel alive. So when I found a small, unlisted cabin for rent deep in the forest, I jumped at the chance to spend a week alone, away from everything. The listing had been simple, almost bare bones. A 2-room cabin, basic utilities, and miles from the nearest town. The idea of having no neighbors, no traffic, no city lights, felt like freedom. I imagined myself reading, writing, hiking, and sleeping under the stars. I did not imagine fear, not in the slightest. The drive to the cabin was long, winding through narrow dirt roads that twisted between dense trees. My car rattled over roots and potholes, and the GPS signal flickered in and out until I was navigating entirely by memory of the directions the owner had sent me. It was late afternoon when I finally spotted the cabin, tucked behind a small rise and partially hidden by overgrown brush. The structure looked old, made of weathered wood, but sturdy. Smoke curled from the chimney, though I couldn't tell if anyone was inside. I parked, grabbed my bags, and stepped onto the wooden porch. The smell of damp wood and pine hit me immediately, a heavy, earthy scent that reminded me I was deep in the forest. Inside, the cabin was small but functional. There was a main room with a kitchenette, a wood stove, and a small table. To the side, A narrow hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight coming through the thin curtains. It was quiet, too quiet maybe, but I welcomed it. I unpacked slowly, laying out my clothes, setting up my laptop and notebook on the table, arranging my food in the small cupboard. I felt a flicker of satisfaction. This was exactly the solitude I had been craving. The first night was peaceful. I made a fire in the wood stove and sat reading until the flames dwindled. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds. The chirp of insects, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small animals. I went to bed early, feeling the cabin settle around me, the floorboards creaking with the shift in temperature. I slept deeply, undisturbed, wrapped in the warmth of a small electric blanket I had brought. Morning came crisp and bright. I decided to explore the nearby trails. The forest was thick, the path overgrown in places, but I moved carefully, enjoying the sound of my boots crunching leaves and twigs. Birds scattered as I approached, and somewhere in the distance, water gurgled. Likely a creek. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. By afternoon, I had circled back to the cabin, feeling a tired but satisfied exhaustion. That night, things changed. Started small. I had been reading near the stove when I heard it. A faint sound, like scraping wood. I froze, straining to listen. The cabin was old. Wood creaks were normal, I told myself. I tried to shake off the unease and focused on my book. Minutes later, the noise came again, louder this time, accompanied by a thump from the back of the cabin, the side facing the forest. My heart rate spiked. There was no one supposed to be here. No one. I grabbed a flashlight and walked cautiously to the back door. The forest stretched dark and silent behind it, but nothing seemed out of place. The brush swayed slightly, stirred by the wind, and I took a deep breath, convincing myself it was nothing. I locked the door again and sat down, trying to calm my thoughts. The next day, I decided to stay inside more. I felt watched, though I couldn't see anyone. Shadows seemed longer, darker, like they were moving with intention. When I stepped outside briefly to collect firewood, I noticed footprints in the soft mud near the cabin. I froze. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints, human-sized, and they led from the edge of the forest directly to my porch. I followed them with my eyes, trying to convince myself they were old. But the prints were fresh. The realization hit me like a punch. Someone had been here while I was inside, watching. My panic was quiet, controlled, but deep. I packed a small bag with essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. I left my laptop and notebook. I didn't want to risk making the cabin look like I planned to stay longer. I tried to tell myself I could leave safely in the morning, but the thought of spending the night alone in that cabin made my stomach churn. The sun sank low, turning the forest into a shadowed maze. I stayed inside, listening. Footsteps again, soft at first, then louder, circling the cabin. I didn't dare look through the windows. My mind raced. The door handle rattled once, twice, as if someone tested it. I held my breath, pressed against the wall, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. Time dragged unbearably. The sound stopped, and I couldn't tell if the person had left or was simply waiting, hidden in the dark. I did not sleep. By dawn, I had made a decision. I would leave, but quietly, slowly, without alerting whoever was out there. I packed the last of my things, slipped on my boots, and opened the door a fraction to peer outside. The forest looked empty, but I could not risk a run. I moved step by step, scanning constantly, my heart hammering with every twig that snapped. I made it to the car, keeping my flashlight ready, and started the engine slowly. The headlights cut through the pre-dawn fog. I drove at a crawl, scanning the treeline constantly. Something moved in the distance, too far to make out, but definitely human. I sped up, gripping the wheel tightly. The dirt road twisted and turned, my headlights illuminating nothing but the dark shapes of trees. The fear was physical, like a weight pressing on my chest, but I kept driving, refusing to stop. Hours later, I finally reached the main road. The relief was overwhelming. Cars passed occasionally, and the signs of civilization felt surreal after the isolation of the forest. I stopped at the first gas station I saw, shaking as I filled my tank. I called the police from inside, explaining everything: the cabin, the footprints, the noises. They took my statement, noting that the cabin was in a remote area and that I was lucky nothing had escalated. They sent a patrol car to check it out later. A few days after returning home, I received a call from the police. They had inspected the cabin. Someone had indeed been living in the nearby woods, using the cabin's proximity to observe travelers. They found makeshift bedding hidden behind the cabin and evidence that the person had watched the cabin for weeks, waiting for the right moment. It had been a man, alone, opportunistic, likely desperate. No one had been hurt, but it was a sobering reminder that isolation could be dangerous. After that experience, I never returned to that cabin. I researched other rentals in secluded areas, but I realized I needed safety as much as solitude. I learned to check for hidden signs, to trust my instincts, and to prepare for the worst, even when venturing for peace. The memory of those footsteps and the feeling of being watched stayed with me for months. A quiet, persistent fear I couldn't shake. But life went on. I told my friends, I shared the story, and I eventually found a small cabin near a lake, still quiet, still private, but much closer to help if I needed it. I stayed there for longer periods, confident in my precautions. The forest remained beautiful, peaceful, and full of life, but I never underestimated it again. Never underestimated how real danger could be when no one is around. Even now, years later, I remember the weight of that night, the long, silent hours, the scraping on the wood, the sound of footsteps in the dark, and I know I was lucky. Lucky to leave unscathed. Lucky that fear was the only thing I carried out with me. And that lesson, more than any comfort or serenity I had imagined, stayed with me forever. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The city was exhausting, a constant blur of noise, traffic, and deadlines, and the idea of escaping to a remote cabin in the woods was a dream I couldn't ignore. I had found a small place listed online, a rustic cabin tucked far enough into the forest that cell reception was practically non-existent. That was exactly what I wanted: complete isolation. The pictures showed a sturdy wooden structure, a small porch, and a nearby stream. I imagined myself sitting outside, reading, maybe hiking a bit, completely cut off from the outside world. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky a dull gray, hinting at rain. The drive had been long, winding through narrow, poorly maintained roads that snaked through dense forest. I remember the sound of the tires crunching over gravel and the occasional deer darting into the trees. When I finally reached the cabin, I realized how remote it truly was. There were no neighbors in sight, just a clearing surrounded by towering pines and oaks. The cabin itself looked more worn in person than in the photos. The wood was darkened with age, and the porch boards creaked when I stepped onto them. The windows were dusty, and the front door had a rusty latch, but the place seemed solid. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine for the next week. I unloaded my car slowly, deliberately, trying to settle into the rhythm of isolation. I brought with me supplies: a small cooler with food, bottled water, a few packs of instant meals, and plenty of snacks. I had a lantern, flashlights, batteries, a small camping stove, and a first aid kit. I didn't have a plan for emergencies beyond that, which in hindsight was foolish, but I didn't think much about it at the time. The first evening passed quietly. I lit a small fire in the fireplace, cooked a simple meal of beans and rice, and watched the dim orange glow flicker against the walls. Outside, the forest was dark, almost black, the kind of darkness that feels alive, though I convinced myself it was only the trees blocking the fading light. The first night was strange but not frightening. I heard the usual forest sounds: an owl calling somewhere in the distance, the rustle of branches as small animals moved, and the wind weaving through the trees. I slept in the cabin's single bedroom, which had a small mattress, a blanket, and a pillow. It wasn't comfortable, but it was enough. I woke once or twice to the wind, which rattled the windows, but I told myself it was natural, normal. By morning, I felt refreshed. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. I stepped outside to stretch and breathe the crisp forest air, the scent of damp pine filling my lungs. Over the next 2 days, I settled into a routine. I hiked along small trails I found near the cabin, exploring a stream that curved through the forest, noting animal tracks, the occasional bird's nest, and the way the light shifted in the trees. I gathered firewood, refilled my water from the stream after filtering it, and spent the evenings reading or sitting by the fire. The isolation was peaceful at first, but gradually I began noticing things that felt off. Small things. Footsteps when I was sure I had seen no one. The faint scent of smoke when no fire should have been lit. The sensation of being watched. My rational mind blamed my imagination, the unfamiliar sounds of the forest, or fatigue from hiking. By the third night, the unease had grown. I was in bed, the lantern dimly lighting the room, when I heard a thud outside, followed by a scraping noise. My heart rate jumped. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped. I told myself it was a branch falling or an animal. Still, I stayed awake for hours, straining to hear anything unusual. Around midnight, I finally drifted into a fitful sleep, waking repeatedly to the sensation that someone was near the cabin. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and my small camping knife and stepped outside, scanning the perimeter. The ground near the cabin was undisturbed except for my own footprints and some animal tracks I didn't recognize. There was no sign of human presence. I shook my head and tried to laugh at myself. Fear, I realized, had a way of twisting perception. I made breakfast and tried to ignore the feeling of unease. But by evening, the sounds had returned. Scratches at the walls, the subtle crunch of footsteps circling the cabin, low rustling in the underbrush. I checked my car. The doors were locked, the windows intact, but the sensation that I was being watched refused to fade. The following day, I decided to stay closer to the cabin. I spent the day indoors, cleaning, organizing, and chopping firewood. Despite my precautions, the noises persisted. At one point, I caught movement outside the window. A figure, or perhaps just a trick of shadow, standing just at the treeline. I froze. My heart raced, and I debated leaving immediately, but the nearest town was over an hour's drive, and it was already dark. I stayed inside, the cabin feeling increasingly like a trap rather than a refuge. By the 5th day, the fear became unbearable. I barely slept, too anxious to rest for long stretches. Every sound, every shadow triggered panic. I realized my isolation had turned against me. What began as a peaceful retreat had become a survival scenario in my mind. I examined the doors and windows, reinforcing locks with spare wood and any heavy object I could find. I moved furniture to create barriers and placed the lantern in the center of the room, ready to see any movement in the dark. I felt the edges of sanity fraying as the forest outside seemed to grow darker and more oppressive with each passing hour. Then, one night, the presence outside became undeniable. The thudding and scraping were louder, deliberate, close. I held my knife tight, heart hammering, and watched as shadows moved against the walls. I realized this was no animal. This was a human. Panic surged, but I forced myself to stay calm. I could hear breathing, slow and measured, circling the cabin. The rational part of me shouted to leave, but I had no immediate escape in the dark forest, no one to call. My mind raced with possibilities. A lost hiker, a criminal, someone hiding from the law, someone with worse intentions. By the second night, my nerves were fraying. I had heard noises all afternoon, branches cracking under some unseen weight, the distant sound of growls that could have been anything from a coyote to a bear. I tried to keep the fire going all night, moving logs carefully, listening, alert. At one point, I thought I saw movement outside one of the windows. A dark shape passed across the edge of my vision. I froze, my heart pounding. I told myself it was my imagination, but I could not shake the feeling that something was there, waiting, just outside the cabin. Sleep was impossible. I lay in the loft, staring at the ceiling, listening to the forest. The wind picked up, rattling the windows. A strange scratching sound started at the door below, faint but persistent. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon, maybe a fox. But the noise continued, deliberate, like something testing the strength of the door. My chest tightened. My hands trembled. I grabbed a heavy kitchen knife, holding it in front of me like it would protect me. Hours passed. The scratching stopped, and the cabin fell silent again. I didn't dare sleep. I spent the entire night awake, listening to the forest, ready for anything. When dawn came, I cautiously opened the door. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone or anything that could have made the noise. I felt relief, but it was brittle and fleeting. I realized then that the cabin, the forest, the isolation, all of it had a weight to it, a tension that was invisible until you were immersed in it. Over the next day, I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the fire burning, I inspected the windows, reinforced the door with a piece of wood I found, and I made sure all the food was stored where no animal could get it. I didn't want to be complacent. The forest was unpredictable, and being unprepared could be fatal. I realized then that this isolation was not just peaceful, it was dangerous. The second night, I heard it again. Something scratching at the walls, moving around the cabin. I stayed low in the loft, knife in hand, listening. This time, I could hear footsteps pacing outside, slow, deliberate. My heart thudded in my chest, but I forced myself to remain calm. I waited, focusing on every sound, every shift of the wind, every snap of a twig. Hours passed, and finally, the footsteps faded. I could not see anything outside, but I knew the forest had eyes, that the wilderness did not care about my presence. By the third day, exhaustion had set in. I realized that staying in the cabin longer than I had planned was foolish. I needed to leave while I still could, before something happened. I packed my bag with essentials, grabbed a few extra cans of food, and prepared to hike out. The path back was not easy. The forest had swallowed the trail, overgrown with ferns and brush, uneven, treacherous. I moved carefully, scanning for any signs of animals, listening for the slightest sound. Every step made me tense. Every shadow seemed alive. Hours into the hike, I finally reached the main dirt road. Relief washed over me, heavy and overwhelming. I started walking toward where I had parked my car, and the forest behind me seemed to recede. I glanced back once, half expecting to see something standing among the trees, but there was nothing, just silence. When I finally reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. I drove off the mountain slowly, checking the rearview mirror repeatedly, half expecting to see some shadow following me. But the road was empty. As I descended, I felt a strange sense of gratitude, not for the cabin, not for the forest, but for the ordinary, everyday world I was returning to. The danger had been real, but I had survived because I stayed alert, because I respected the wilderness and my own limits. Back in town, I stopped at a small diner, sitting with a cup of coffee in my hands. My muscles ached. My mind still replayed the nights in that cabin. The sounds, the shadows, the weight of the forest pressing in on me. But the relief was profound. I had learned something about myself, about fear, about vigilance, about the way the natural world could challenge and test you. I knew I would remember this trip forever, not as a story of terror, but as a story of survival, of cautious courage, of respect for the wild. Even weeks later, I still felt it sometimes. The quiet moments when I would hear a distant rustle or a faint scratch against my window, and I would remember that cabin, that forest, the isolation, and the feeling of being utterly alone with the unknown. But now I could also smile, knowing I had made it through. I had been careful, aware, prepared, and I had survived. And that was a clear, undeniable truth. The forest had not won, and I had left it intact, with my life and my mind whole. I had been driving for hours, the sun long gone behind the thick pines as the winding road became narrower and more uneven. My plan was simple. A few days alone at a small cabin I had rented deep in the forest. I had wanted solitude, a break from the noise of the city, and the chance to clear my mind. The cabin was supposed to be remote, off the grid, with nothing but forest for miles around. I had packed carefully, bringing enough food, water, and supplies for a week, though I expected to stay only 3 days. When I finally reached the gravel driveway, it felt more like a path through the woods than an actual road. The tires crunched over stones and loose dirt as I pulled up to the cabin. The cabin itself was small, made of dark wood that blended with the surrounding trees. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, though no one had said anyone else would be there. The windows were dusty and slightly fogged from the cool night air, and the front door creaked as I opened it. Inside, it smelled faintly of damp wood and old pine. The interior was simple: a single room with a small kitchen corner, a wood-burning stove, and a loft above where a bed was tucked under the slanted roof. There were a few chairs and a table, and on a shelf I found some old books and magazines. Everything seemed functional, though a bit neglected. I set my bags down, feeling the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. For now, I was alone. I spent the first hour unpacking, making a small fire in the stove to warm the cabin. The wood smelled sharp when it burned, and the flames crackled loudly, filling the room with both warmth and a sense of life. Outside, I could hear the wind moving through the trees and the occasional snap of a branch. I told myself it was just the forest settling for the night, but it made my stomach tighten a little. I tried to distract myself by organizing my supplies and checking the small gas lantern I had brought along. Everything was in order. Still, the silence outside felt heavy, pressing in against the cabin walls. I made a small dinner of canned beans heated over the stove, eating slowly and listening for any unusual sounds. The forest was alive with the usual night noises: rustling leaves, distant hoots of owls, the snap of twigs. But there was an unnatural stillness too. It wasn't empty. It was tense, like the forest was holding its breath. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just being alone, but I couldn't shake a creeping unease. Later, as I tried to sleep in the loft, the floorboards beneath the bed groaned under my weight. The small cabin seemed to settle around me with every creak and pop of wood. I kept my backpack near the bed, thinking I might need it quickly. Hours passed in fragmented sleep, broken by the wind rattling the shutters and the occasional distant sound that made me sit up and strain my ears. Every noise seemed amplified in the dark. Every shadow moved strangely with the flickering of the lantern light I had left burning. It was a disorienting, tense night. By morning, I was exhausted but relieved the night had passed without incident. The next day, I decided to explore a little, staying close to the cabin but walking the small paths visible through the trees. The forest was thick, and I soon found myself surrounded by the dense trunks and undergrowth. Moss covered the ground in patches, and the sun made small streaks of light through the branches. Birds flitted through the trees, and the smell of damp earth was strong. It felt peaceful at first, a welcome contrast to the anxiety I had felt the night before. But as I wandered further, I began to notice small signs that made me pause. There were footprints in the soft dirt near the path. Not human footprints exactly, more like shoe prints, but they were small, narrow, and deep. They didn't follow a straight line, as if someone had been walking slowly, stopping often. I couldn't see where they had come from or where they went, and the thought of someone else being near the cabin made a cold sweat break out on my back. I had been planning this trip for months. After weeks of work that had drained me physically and mentally, I decided to escape to a cabin deep in the mountains, far from roads, towns, and people. I wanted complete silence and isolation. The cabin I rented was small, wooden, and old, tucked into a dense forest at the foot of a mountain. The directions I received were precise but vague in parts, telling me to follow a narrow dirt track for several miles until I reached a barely visible sign. The last stretch of the road was barely a path at all, overgrown with grass and weeds. I drove slowly, hearing the tires crunch over rocks and loose soil, until I finally saw the cabin. It was smaller than I had imagined, with weathered wood and a tin roof, surrounded by tall pine trees. Smoke was rising from a small stone chimney, though I was certain no one else was there yet. The forest was dense, the trees pressed close together, and I realized that I couldn't see the sky properly from inside the cabin yard. The isolation hit me immediately. My phone had no signal, and there were no visible trails or other cabins nearby. I parked and stepped out, taking a deep breath. The air was cold and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Inside, the cabin was modest but functional. There was a small kitchen area with a wood-burning stove, a single bed in a corner, and a table and chair near the window. On the walls, there were hooks for tools and lanterns. I dropped my backpack on the floor, inspected the stove, and found a box of matches. The cabin felt old, with creaking floors and walls that shifted slightly as the wind blew outside. It wasn't particularly clean. Dust covered most surfaces, and the smell of damp wood was strong. But it felt safe enough for now. I unpacked my supplies. Food, a water filter, extra clothes, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. The first night was quiet, though the forest around me was alive with sounds. I could hear small animals scurrying in the underbrush, and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere deeper in the woods. I made a fire in the stove and heated some canned soup, feeling the warmth spread through my body. I tried to read, but sleep came fast. When I closed my eyes, I felt a strange unease, like I wasn't entirely alone. I shook it off as paranoia. The forest was big, the cabin was old, and I was just imagining things. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The trees were tall and thick, and sunlight barely reached the forest floor. I noticed deer tracks, and some broken branches suggested larger animals passed through. As I walked further, I found a small creek, its water cold and clear. I marked the path to the creek and returned to the cabin, carrying water in a container. It felt good to move, and the quietness of the forest was oddly comforting. Yet, as I approached the cabin later in the afternoon, I noticed something strange. The ground near the door had small, shallow footprints that I was sure I hadn't seen when I arrived. They were not human-sized, but were small and seemed irregular, like something had shuffled there. I examined the footprints carefully. They weren't fresh, but the dirt was disturbed, and I felt my stomach tighten. There were no other signs of intruders, no broken branches, no other tracks. But the thought of someone or something having been near the cabin while I slept made me uneasy. I stayed inside the rest of the day, checking the doors and windows. The cabin felt more enclosed now, almost like it was a trap, though I knew it was just the old structure and the heavy forest. That night, the wind picked up. The trees groaned and rubbed against each other, and the cabin shivered with every gust. Around midnight, I was woken by a noise outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. The faint sound of footsteps crunching over dry leaves, circling the cabin. I froze. My first thought was that an animal had come close, but the footsteps were irregular, deliberate, and slow. I held my breath and pressed myself against the wall, listening. The sound stopped, and the silence returned, so heavy it pressed against my ears. I couldn't sleep after that. I sat by the stove with a small lantern, listening to every sound. When the noises came again, I realized they weren't moving randomly. They were waiting, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, always stopping when I strained to look outside. The next day, I decided to prepare. I collected heavy sticks and branches from the yard, checking all the windows and doors. I moved furniture in front of the cabin door as a barricade and kept a flashlight and a large knife beside my bed. I didn't dare go far from the cabin that day, and I barely left the cabin yard. The forest now felt threatening. Every shadow between the trees looked like it was hiding something, and I was constantly listening. That evening, I noticed something even more disturbing. Some of my supplies had been moved slightly. A can of food I had placed on the table was knocked over, and the lid had a small scratch across it. My heart pounded. I wasn't imagining things anymore. Someone had been inside. I checked the doors and windows again, all latched, but the small movements were enough to confirm my fear. Someone, or something, was watching me. I stayed awake all night, keeping a fire burning in the stove. I didn't dare sleep, knowing I could be approached at any moment. The following day, I decided I needed a plan to leave. I had parked my car on the dirt track several miles away, and now it felt too dangerous to go alone. I decided to wait until daylight and to travel fast and quietly. I packed as much as I could into my backpack, leaving only what was necessary. I also decided to make noise as I moved, hoping to scare off anything that might be following me. Early the next morning, I began my journey down the track. The forest was quieter than before, but I stayed alert, scanning every tree and bush. About a mile from the cabin, I heard a noise behind me. A snapping branch, slow, deliberate. My heart raced, and I started walking faster, keeping my backpack balanced and my hands ready on the knife. I couldn't see anyone or anything, but the feeling of being followed was constant. I tried not to run, knowing that would leave me vulnerable if someone caught me. When I finally reached the car, I checked around it carefully. Everything seemed untouched. I got inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. The car roared to life, and I drove off slowly at first, then faster, glancing in the rearview mirror. The dirt track twisted through the forest, narrow and rutted, and I stayed focused, keeping the car steady over the rough terrain. I kept looking behind me, half expecting to see someone or something emerge from the trees. But the forest was empty, silent except for the car and the occasional bird. After several miles, I reached a paved road and felt my tension begin to ease. The isolation, the sounds in the night, and the sense of being watched had been overwhelming. I pulled over at a small rest area, letting my body relax. I called the local authorities to report what had happened and described the cabin, the footprints, and the signs of intrusion. They said they would investigate, though I doubted anything concrete would come of it. I stayed the night in a motel near the road. I couldn't shake the feeling of fear, but I also felt relief that I had made it out safely. Over the next few days, I followed up with the local authorities, who confirmed that there had been reports of trespassers in the area. Apparently, some squatters occasionally broke into cabins in the forest, looking for supplies or a place to hide. That explained the footprints, the moved supplies, and the sounds at night. The thought that it had been human, and not something fantastical, was both terrifying and comforting. Looking back, I realized how unprepared I had been. The isolation had made everything feel more intense, every sound amplified, every shadow threatening. But I had survived because I stayed alert, planned carefully, and trusted my instincts. I didn't go back to that cabin, and I never will. The experience left a mark on me, teaching me the value of caution and the unpredictable nature of solitude in the wild. The forest, I understood, was not dangerous in itself, but people could be. That lesson stayed with me, a sharp memory I could never forget. Months later, I returned to the mountains, but to a more populated trail and a group cabin area. I still love the forest, still crave the quiet, but I never underestimate the reality of isolation and the potential of others to intrude. The fear I felt that night was real, human, and grounded in reality, and surviving it gave me a perspective I could never have imagined before. That cabin taught me to respect not just nature, but the vulnerability of being truly alone. I had been planning this trip for months, a break from the city, from the noise, the constant pressure of work, and the endless scrolling on my phone that left me more anxious every day. I found a small cabin online, far away in the northern mountains, advertised as completely private, secluded, and surrounded by untouched wilderness. The photos were beautiful. A rustic wooden cabin with a small porch, surrounded by pine trees, with a narrow creek running nearby. It seemed perfect. I booked it immediately, even though I had never been camping or stayed anywhere remote alone. The idea of solitude called to me like a whisper, promising calm, quiet, and a chance to breathe without interruptions. I arrived late afternoon. The drive had been long, winding through narrow mountain roads that twisted and dipped along sheer drops. By the time I reached the small dirt path that led to the cabin, the sun was already low, casting long shadows across the pine forest. The last mile of the path was rough, full of rocks and potholes, and I had to drive slowly, carefully, making sure not to scrape the car on the jagged edges of the road. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, my arms were sore from gripping the steering wheel, and the air smelled different. Crisp, sharp, scented with pine needles and damp earth. The cabin itself was small, 2 rooms and a loft, built from heavy, rough timber. It looked solid, as if it had been there for decades, weathered by the mountain winds. I parked the car on the uneven dirt clearing in front, opened the cabin door, and stepped inside. The floor creaked under my weight, the wood groaning slightly as I moved. The place was empty, silent except for the faint whisper of wind through the gaps in the logs. Dust coated the corners, and I noticed small cobwebs near the ceiling, but it felt lived in a way I couldn't explain, like someone had left in a hurry but not too long ago. I spent the first hour unpacking, placing my things neatly on the small table, setting up the sleeping bag in the loft, and making a small fire in the stone fireplace. The wood smelled faintly of smoke and resin, and as I lit it, the flames flickered, warming the room and pushing the chill away. Outside, the shadows were already stretching across the forest floor. I could see the trees moving slightly, swaying with the wind, and hear the occasional snap of a branch. Birds were silent now, only the faint rustle of leaves filled the air. As night fell, I settled near the fireplace with a book and a small lantern. The cabin felt safe, insulated from the world, almost cocoon-like. But as darkness deepened, the quiet became heavier, more intense. Every small sound, the creak of the roof, the hiss of the fire, the faint scrape of something outside, seemed magnified. My mind started to wander. What if I wasn't as alone as I thought? What if someone else was out there, moving silently among the trees, watching? The rational part of me reminded myself that this was impossible, that the nearest neighbors were miles away, that the road was difficult even in daylight, but my imagination refused to be convinced. Around 10 o'clock, I went outside to refill my water from the creek nearby. The night was still and clear, the stars sharp and bright overhead. The moonlight lit the forest in a cold silver glow. As I bent down to scoop water from the shallow creek, I heard a faint noise, like a footstep or a branch snapping. Not behind me, but somewhere off in the forest. I froze, heart hammering, trying to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. The noise stopped. I stood there for a long moment, listening, but all I could hear was the water trickling and the wind in the trees. I shook my head, took the water back inside, and bolted the door behind me. I tried to sleep that night, but I barely closed my eyes before every small sound made me startle awake. The wind rattling the roof, the creak of the floorboards, the occasional thump from outside. It all felt deliberate, like something was moving just beyond the edge of the light. I kept telling myself it was just the house settling, just the wind, just the forest being alive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was beautiful, almost unbearably so, with tall pines and firs that seemed endless. The creek wound through moss-covered rocks, and small animal tracks dotted the mud. I found evidence of deer and rabbits, maybe even a fox. But I also found something else. Footprints near the cabin, larger than mine, not clearly human, but definitely something big and deliberate. I couldn't make out the exact shape, but they were there, pressed into the soft earth, leading into the forest and back. I stared at them for a long time. There had been no one else in the car with me. The last guests had left days ago, yet these prints were fresh. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably a large dog or a bear. I had brought bear spray, just in case, and I made a mental note to keep the cabin door locked at all times. But all day, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. I stayed close to the cabin, gathering firewood and checking the perimeter. I didn't see anything unusual, but the feeling of being watched never left. Every time I looked into the trees, I half expected to see someone, or something, staring back at me. That night was worse. I had dinner near the fire, then sat in the loft reading until the flames died down. Around midnight, I heard it. A soft, deliberate tapping at the side of the cabin. Not the kind of noise a tree or branch makes. It was rhythmic, almost intentional. My heart stopped. I grabbed the flashlight, sweeping it across the darkened clearing. Nothing. I stepped closer to the door, listening. Tap, tap, tap. I could hear it, slow and steady, coming from the side porch. I gripped the knife I had brought with me and stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The porch was empty. The trees were still. I checked the perimeter, circling the cabin carefully, but found nothing. No footprints, no movement, nothing. I returned inside, hands shaking, and sat by the fire, trying to calm myself. But the tapping started again, this time from the roof. I could feel it above me, small, precise knocks, like someone walking carefully on the shingles. I didn't dare go outside. I stayed in the loft, huddled under my sleeping bag, holding the knife, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. Hours passed. The tapping eventually stopped, but I didn't sleep. I waited for daylight. When morning came, I decided I had to leave. I packed quickly, threw the remaining food into my bag, and grabbed my car keys. But when I opened the door, I saw that my car tires were flattened. Someone had punctured them overnight. Panic hit me. I ran back into the cabin, checking all the windows and doors. All locks were in place, but the sense of intrusion, of someone deliberately trying to trap me, was overwhelming. I had no phone signal. The nearest road was miles away. I couldn't call for help. I spent the next several hours figuring out a plan. The only option was to try to hike down the mountain to a road where I could get help. I packed supplies, water, a few snacks, the flashlight, the knife, and extra layers of clothing. I left the cabin cautiously, keeping my eyes and ears alert. Every step on the narrow dirt path was tense. Every rustle in the trees made me jump. I kept imagining someone following me, hiding behind trees, waiting for me to slip or fall. The forest seemed endless, the trail twisting and turning in ways that made me feel disoriented. After hours of careful walking, I finally reached a small dirt road. I could see a car approaching in the distance. I ran toward it, waving frantically. The driver stopped, and I explained, breathless and terrified, that I had been staying in a remote cabin and needed help. They called the local sheriff for me. The deputies arrived quickly, driving me back to the cabin. We checked the area together. There were fresh footprints around the cabin, larger than mine, some leading into the forest, some returning. They didn't belong to any local animals, and there was no evidence of wildlife capable of making those precise movements. The deputies said it was likely someone had been observing the cabin, maybe even living nearby in the forest, hidden, watching for people who stayed there alone. They couldn't find anyone, and by the time they searched the area thoroughly, there were no signs of the intruder. But they agreed. The damage to my car, the footprints, and the tapping noises indicated that I had been targeted by a person, not an animal. The cabin was abandoned after that. I never stayed there again. I learned later from local authorities that there had been other reports in the area of hikers and visitors being watched, sometimes followed, sometimes vandalized, but no one was ever caught. The forest was vast, and someone determined could easily hide among the trees for days without being noticed. I never forgot that trip. Even years later, I could remember the smell of the pine, the cold air biting at my face, the darkness pressing in on the cabin at night. I could feel the silence of the forest, the way it seemed alive and waiting. I knew then that the mountains held more than beauty. They held danger, not of wild animals or ghosts, but of people hiding in the shadows, patient, silent, and unseen. And I knew that I had been lucky to leave when I did. The experience taught me respect for solitude in the wilderness and the importance of preparation. Since then, I always check my surroundings, make sure I have multiple ways to communicate, and never underestimate the ability of someone to hide and watch. It changed how I traveled, how I approached isolation, and how I understood fear, not the imagined kind, but the real, calculated human kind. Even now, whenever I see a cabin tucked away in the woods, I feel that tightness in my chest, that faint reminder that the world is full of quiet dangers. And I know with certainty that the forest, no matter how beautiful, can hold secrets that are better left undiscovered. That night, I couldn't stay inside the cabin. I was too anxious. I decided to sleep in my car, parked near the clearing. The headlights off, engine cold. I sat with a blanket wrapped around me, listening. The forest was alive with noises, branches snapping, animals moving, but nothing human. I kept the doors locked, and when I heard what I thought were footsteps on the gravel outside, I froze. My hands clenched the steering wheel. The sound moved around the car, soft but deliberate, then faded. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't risk staying another night without knowing who or what was out there. I packed quickly, grabbed my things, and left the cabin. On my way down the dirt road, I noticed something I hadn't before. Markings on the trees, faint but deliberate, not like natural scratches. It was a system of signs pointing towards certain areas, maybe traps or warnings. I didn't stop to examine them. I drove as fast as the road allowed, my heart still racing, until I reached the main highway. Back in town, I called the local ranger station. I explained that I had rented a cabin and found signs of someone living nearby, and that I felt unsafe. The ranger promised to check it out. Later that week, I learned that there had been reports of a man living illegally in the woods, moving between abandoned cabins, stealing supplies, and avoiding detection. He had been careful, leaving minimal traces, but local authorities were tracking him. My encounter could have been dangerous. I never went back to that cabin. I rented a different place, closer to other cabins and more accessible roads. The experience stayed with me for months. The feeling of being watched, the footprints, the hidden campsite. It left a mark I couldn't shake. I realized how easy it was to feel safe in a place that looked peaceful, and how quickly that safety could vanish when someone else had been there without my knowledge. Eventually, I returned to the mountains, but not alone and not to that cabin. I learned to trust my instincts more, to recognize the signs of another presence, and to be cautious in remote areas. The isolation that had once seemed like freedom now carried a weight, a reminder that the wilderness, beautiful as it is, can hide dangers that are all too human. I understood that the good ending wasn't just leaving safely, it was learning, adjusting, and respecting the environment, including the people who might use it in ways I couldn't control. I still think about that cabin, about the prints in the dirt, the hidden campsite, the creaking on the porch at night. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't a story from a fairy tale. It was real, and it reminded me how vulnerable we are when we isolate ourselves, even in places that seem safe. That fear, that realization, has stayed with me, sharper and more vivid than any imaginary ghost. And that, I suppose, is the lesson I carry from that weekend. Awareness, caution, and the knowledge that sometimes the scariest things are not what we imagine. They are very real, very human, and very close. I had been driving for hours through the mountains, the kind of roads that wound in tight curves, cutting through thick pine forests, with nothing but the hum of my car and the occasional bird call to break the silence. I was exhausted but determined to reach the cabin I had rented for the weekend. It was advertised as secluded, far from any other houses, perfect for a solo retreat to think and escape the constant noise of the city. I had packed enough food for a week, my camping gear, and a few books, imagining long nights by the fire reading, the only sound being the wind outside. The last stretch of road was gravel, rough and uneven. My tires kicked up small stones as I navigated around sharp bends. The trees were tall, old, and so close together that sunlight barely touched the road. At some point, the gravel turned to dirt, and the road narrowed further, to a single lane that barely fit my car. My confidence in the directions I had printed out on my phone wavered, but the GPS showed I was getting close. After the final bend, I saw the cabin. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by trees, old but solid, with a stone chimney and a small wooden porch. The paint was weathered, the roof slightly mossy, but the cabin seemed sturdy. I parked and stepped out, the crisp mountain air hitting me sharply. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I shrugged it off as the usual mountain stillness, grabbed my bags, and entered the cabin. Inside, it smelled of old wood and faint mildew, but not overwhelmingly so. The main room had a fireplace, a kitchen area, and a small table with chairs. There were a couple of bedrooms, a bathroom, and a loft. It was sparsely furnished but comfortable enough. I unpacked, set my things down, and lit a fire in the fireplace. The sound of the flames crackling was reassuring after the long drive. The first night passed uneventfully. I made dinner on the small stove, drank some water from the tap, and sat by the fire, reading until my eyelids grew heavy. I slept deeply, only waking when the wind picked up and rattled the windows. It was the kind of sound that could make someone feel isolated, but I was alone by choice. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. There was a small path behind the cabin that led into the woods. I walked for hours, the trail winding through dense trees, past a creek, and over fallen logs. The sunlight barely reached the forest floor, making everything seem darker and cooler than the open clearing. I noticed animal tracks, possibly deer or foxes, but nothing that alarmed me. When I returned, I felt a little tired but content. I made a small fire outside, sat on the porch, and watched the sun set behind the hills. It was quiet and beautiful. That night, however, something felt off. I couldn't place it at first. I had double-checked the doors and windows before going to bed, making sure everything was locked. The fireplace cast shadows across the room as I read, but I kept glancing toward the door, feeling uneasy. Then I heard it, a soft scratching, coming from somewhere outside. I froze. It didn't sound like an animal, or at least not like anything I had heard in the forest before. My heart started to beat faster. The sound stopped as suddenly as it began. I told myself it was probably a branch rubbing against the cabin, or some small animal. But the next morning, I noticed something. Near the back door, the ground was disturbed. Small footprints, not animal, leading into the trees and stopping a few feet away. I knelt down, examining them closely. They looked like they had been made recently. My stomach tightened. I had told myself that no one else knew about this cabin. It was supposed to be remote, isolated. And yet, there were footprints. I spent the next day on edge. I stayed mostly inside, only going out to gather firewood and fetch water. Every noise made me jump. The rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig, the distant call of a bird. I checked the locks constantly, even though I knew it was futile to be paranoid all the time. Still, the feeling of being watched was inescapable. On the third night, it happened again. I was sitting in the main room, the fire casting a warm glow, when I heard it. A faint creak from the porch, like someone stepping lightly on the wood. I froze, listening intently. The sound moved around the cabin, stopping at the back. I grabbed the flashlight I had brought, my hands trembling. Slowly, I stepped outside, shining the light around the clearing. Everything was still. Nothing moved. No signs of anyone. But the prints were back, closer this time, leading toward the woods. I spent the night in the loft, flashlight in hand, listening. The wind was stronger now, shaking the trees and making the cabin groan. Couldn't sleep. Every creak of the wood made me tense. Every shadow seemed to move. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted, my nerves raw. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't stay cooped up, but I also didn't feel safe going for a walk alone. So I decided to investigate the area around the cabin more carefully. During the day, I examined the perimeter. I found more footprints, leading from the nearby forest to the cabin and back. They weren't recent. They had been there for some days, probably overlapping with my arrival. My heart sank. Someone had been around the cabin before I got here, possibly watching, maybe even living nearby. I looked for clues. Scraps of food, broken branches, anything. I found a small campsite about 200 meters from the cabin, hidden behind dense trees. There was a fire pit, old cans, and pieces of cloth. Someone had been here, and possibly not too long ago. I had been driving for hours through the winding mountain roads, the kind that seemed to narrow and twist more sharply the higher you went. The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest, and the air was colder than I expected for early autumn. I had rented a small cabin for a week, somewhere remote, far from the nearest town. I needed the isolation, a chance to clear my mind, but I didn't expect how intense it would feel to be truly alone. The GPS signal kept flickering, cutting out completely at times, and I realized I couldn't rely on it to guide me all the way. I had a paper map in my bag, but following it meant slowing down and constantly checking for the right turns, which made the drive even longer. The road became dirt and gravel, uneven and narrow. Trees pressed close on both sides, their trunks tall and straight, leaving the sky only visible in narrow strips overhead. The silence was heavy. No cars, no birds, no distant voices. Nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I told myself it was peaceful, that I was lucky to have this solitude, but part of me felt a growing tension, a low hum of unease that I couldn't shake. Eventually, the cabin appeared through the trees. It was small, wooden, and looked older than I expected. The roof had patches where the shingles were worn, and the siding had faded with years of exposure to the elements. A thin chimney rose from one corner, and I noticed faint smoke curling out of it. Someone had been here recently. The sight should have been comforting, but it made my chest tighten. I parked my car nearby, taking note of how overgrown the surrounding yard was. The grass reached my knees, and weeds climbed the edges of the cabin. It felt abandoned, yet not entirely. I stepped inside, and the smell hit me first. Damp wood, dust, and something faintly sour, like mold growing in a corner. The air was cold, far colder than outside, and the wooden floorboards creaked under my weight. There were no signs of anyone living here permanently. No personal items, no dishes, nothing that suggested comfort. But there were signs someone had been here recently. A half-burned fire in the fireplace, an old kettle on the stove with a little water still in it, footprints on the dusty floor that didn't match mine. I set down my bag and began to explore. The cabin was small. A single room with a kitchen corner, a tiny bathroom, and a loft above reached by a narrow wooden ladder. The loft had a mattress on the floor, stained and thin, and a few blankets piled in a corner. Windows were small and grimy, letting in little light as the sun continued to set. Shadows stretched across the walls and floor, making the cabin feel even tighter. I decided to light a fire in the fireplace. I had brought some matches and found dry wood stacked near the back. As the flames caught and began to crackle, the warmth spread slowly, but the feeling of being watched remained. I told myself it was just the wind rattling the cabin, or maybe my own imagination. Night came quickly. I brought a flashlight and checked the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. The cabin had a sense of vulnerability. I could hear the forest around me, the snapping of twigs and occasional distant animal cries. It was dark in a way I hadn't experienced before, where the blackness outside seemed alive. I tried to read a book, hoping to distract myself, but every small sound made me pause. A log fell in the fireplace, sending a spray of sparks across the hearth, and I flinched. Around midnight, the first real sign that I wasn't completely alone came. I was in the loft, trying to sleep on the thin mattress, when I heard it. A soft scraping sound on the porch outside. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. It stopped. I told myself it was probably a branch brushing against the cabin or a small animal. But the sound had been deliberate, rhythmic, as if someone or something was moving slowly along the wooden boards. I sat up and held my flashlight in front of me, but I didn't dare go to the door. The idea of stepping outside in that darkness made my stomach churn. Hours passed. Every small noise amplified my fear. The wind shaking the trees, a distant howl, the shifting of the old roof as it settled. Sleep finally came in short bursts, never deep, always interrupted by the feeling of being observed. Morning light brought some relief, but it also revealed the cabin more clearly. The porch was weathered and narrow, the railing loose. The yard looked even more wild, and I realized there were old footprints leading to the forest edge, faint and partially erased by overnight frost. Whoever had been here had left, but not long ago. I spent the day checking the cabin and surrounding area. I gathered firewood, filled the kettle, and cleaned a little. I tried to convince myself to relax, to enjoy the peace, but every sound in the forest reminded me of the previous night. That evening, I sat by the fire, reading and eating, when I noticed something disturbing. Scratches on the outer wall near the back door, deep, as if made by something sharp. They weren't recent enough to be fresh blood, but they were clear and deliberate, not the work of a deer or bear. My stomach knotted. The thought of someone having been so close without my knowledge made the cabin feel suffocating. That night, I slept even less. I couldn't stop thinking about the scratches, the footprints, the scraping sound on the porch. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again, soft, careful footsteps on the porch boards. This time I didn't move. I lay flat on the mattress, holding my flashlight under the blankets, trying not to breathe loudly. The steps stopped at the corner of the porch. I could hear someone breathing, low and deliberate, and I realized the door had a simple wooden latch. It wouldn't stop anyone determined from opening it. Panic surged, and I scrambled quietly to gather a small pile of firewood and a kitchen knife, planning to make a stand if necessary. The steps moved slightly away from the door, and then I heard the sound of gravel shifting outside, moving into the trees. They were circling, watching, but not entering. I stayed awake until first light, never leaving the loft. By the time the sun rose, the forest had returned to its usual quiet, almost normal. The footsteps and scraping were gone. I considered leaving immediately, but I had no phone signal to call anyone for help. I could try to drive down the mountain, but the road was dangerous, and if someone was around, I didn't want to attract attention. I stayed in the cabin all day, barricading the door with logs and furniture, peering through the small windows. Over the next 2 days, I watched carefully. I moved only for necessities: water from the stream nearby, food from my car. I noticed faint traces in the yard: disturbed leaves, broken branches, footprints fading in the dirt. Whoever had been there was skilled at staying hidden, and I realized that the forest itself could be used against me, that I was at a disadvantage in this terrain. I made sure to keep the fire going at night, thinking the light and smoke might deter anyone. Each night, the scratching and footsteps continued, always at the edge of the porch or circling near the cabin, but never aggressive enough to enter. By the third day, I decided I had to act. I could not stay here indefinitely, and the thought of waiting for whoever it was to make a mistake terrified me. I packed a small bag with essentials: water, a few snacks, the knife, and some blankets. I checked the car, ensuring it was in working order, then prepared the cabin as best I could, covering windows with boards and tying down anything that could be moved from outside. I left a note inside, just in case, explaining that I had left and would contact authorities. The hike back down the mountain was tense. I kept to the car path, moving quickly, constantly scanning the trees. Every shadow looked like someone following me. I did not take breaks. The thought of someone watching, even at a distance, made me jump at every sound. Eventually, the trees thinned, and I could see the highway far below. I reached the car and got in, locking the doors and starting the engine. I drove without looking back, adrenaline carrying me down the mountain until I finally reached a small town where I could stop safely. Once I reached a safe area, I called the police and reported everything: the cabin, the footprints, the scratching, the feeling of being stalked. They noted my report and promised to investigate, but it was clear that they were limited in what they could do in such a remote location. The relief I felt driving on wide roads, with lights from other vehicles around me, was overwhelming. I realized how small and vulnerable I had felt in that cabin, how dependent I was on my own instincts to survive. The experience stayed with me for months. I avoided remote cabins, checked every detail whenever I traveled, and never underestimated how quickly isolation could turn dangerous. Eventually, I learned that the cabin had been used by a transient who lived in the surrounding forest, someone skilled at remaining unseen but observing others closely. The authorities found evidence: makeshift shelters, food caches, footprints, but no direct confrontation. My instinct to leave when I did likely prevented an encounter that could have ended badly. I never returned to the cabin. I kept my experiences private for a long time, reluctant to scare anyone else unnecessarily, but the memory was etched in me. The darkness pressing against the windows, the scratching on the wall, the footsteps circling outside. It was a reminder of how quickly safety can become uncertain, and how careful one must be in the wilderness, especially when alone. From that trip onward, I always made sure to rent cabins that were monitored, in areas with cell service and with visible neighbors. I still enjoy solitude in nature, but the memory of those nights, the fear of being watched and trapped, remains sharp. I learned to respect the forest not just for its beauty, but for the dangers that can exist when someone else knows how to move within it silently. And while I survived without injury, I never forgot the sense of helplessness that comes from being entirely alone in a remote cabin, with someone observing you from the shadows, always just beyond your sight. I had been planning this trip for months, a small escape from the city and all the noise. The cabin I rented was deep in the woods, far enough that cell service was nearly non-existent, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I told myself it would be peaceful, a chance to disconnect and recharge. I didn't expect that peace to come with a creeping, almost physical sense of isolation, or that I would begin to feel like I wasn't as alone as I thought. The drive to the cabin was long and winding. I had taken back roads to avoid highways, enjoying the scenery, the trees stretching endlessly, the occasional deer darting across the road. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer than they should, and the winding dirt road became a ribbon of darkness with only my headlights cutting through it. By the time I reached the cabin, night had fallen completely. The air was thick, cold, and smelled faintly of damp earth and pine. The cabin itself was smaller than I imagined, made of rough timber with a sloping roof and a small porch. The windows were dark, reflecting the forest behind me. It had the usual amenities: running water, a small wood stove, a kitchen with basic utensils, but I immediately noticed that it felt old. Not in a charming way, but in a way that made me aware of every creak in the floorboards and every whistle of the wind through gaps in the walls. I set my things down and started a fire in the stove. The flames crackled and popped, sending dancing shadows across the walls. The sound was comforting at first, but as the night deepened, it also made the cabin feel smaller, the shadows heavier. I moved slowly, checking each room, noticing little details. A patch of mold behind the sink, a window that didn't close properly, the rust on the hinges of the back door. It was all normal for a cabin in the middle of nowhere, I told myself, but the quiet made my own thoughts feel loud. Around midnight, I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside, the groan of the trees, the occasional snap of a branch, felt magnified in the darkness. I kept imagining someone moving just beyond the tree line, glimpses of shapes through the shadows. My rational mind knew it was probably a deer, or a raccoon, or just the wind. Still, I lay there with my heart hammering, feeling exposed in a way I had never felt before. I finally drifted into a restless sleep, only to wake a few hours later to a soft tapping sound. First, I thought it was rain, but there was no storm. It was irregular, deliberate, and coming from the back of the cabin. My first instinct was to ignore it, to convince myself it was the wind, but the sound persisted, growing slightly louder, like something was moving against the back door. I stayed perfectly still, listening, my body frozen with a combination of fear and adrenaline. The tapping continued for nearly half an hour. I debated calling the owner or the police, but with no signal and being miles from any help, that wasn't an option. I thought about leaving immediately, but the back road was dark, and the car was parked some distance away. The idea of stepping outside into that forest at night, alone, made my stomach churn. So I stayed inside, trying to convince myself it was nothing. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I cautiously approached the back door. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the mud. Nothing. I felt a mix of relief and lingering unease. I convinced myself it was probably a raccoon or a branch brushing against the door in the wind. But that rational thought didn't last long. The day was bright and deceptively peaceful. I spent hours walking around the property, taking photographs, collecting firewood. The forest was beautiful, almost hypnotic, with shafts of sunlight cutting through the leaves and the scent of pine strong in the air. Yet even in daylight, I felt watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me flinch. I told myself I was imagining things, that the human brain is prone to paranoia in isolation. Still, the sense of being observed lingered. I returned to the cabin mid-afternoon and decided to explore the interior more thoroughly. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the kitchen counter, near the stove where I had placed my bag the night before, there were fresh scratches, deep, dark streaks, like someone had tried to open the drawers with bare nails. I had no explanation, The drawers had been closed and locked in place with simple latches. My mind raced through possibilities. Wildlife had somehow gotten inside, an animal I hadn't seen, but the scratches looked too deliberate, too controlled. I checked the rest of the cabin carefully. Everything else seemed undisturbed, and there were no footprints on the wooden floorboards. My rational mind fought panic. I told myself it must have been an animal. Maybe a raccoon or a squirrel had managed to squeeze inside through a gap. But the scratches were long, straight, and evenly spaced. That detail made me uneasy. I tried to focus on practicalities. I reinforced the latches, secured the doors, and sat down with a cup of coffee, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Night fell again. I lit the stove and tried to read, but my eyes kept darting to the windows. Every shadow looked like a person standing outside. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps on the porch. Around 10 o'clock, I heard it again, the soft tapping from the back door. My stomach tightened. I didn't move at first, listening. It wasn't just a tap. It was deliberate, in rhythm, almost like someone testing the door. My hands shook as I grabbed a heavy kitchen knife and edged toward the sound. The tapping stopped as soon as I reached the back door. I peered through the small window but saw nothing. The forest beyond was quiet, still, and dark. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, sitting near the stove, knife in hand, staring at the back door. Every creak of the cabin, every sigh of the wind made my heart jump. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I resolved to leave. I packed quickly, carrying my bag to the car. As I stepped outside, I noticed something on the ground near the back door. A single footprint in the soft earth. It was human-sized, but no one was in sight. My pulse quickened. The print led toward the edge of the woods but disappeared within 10 feet, as if whoever it was had vanished into thin air. I didn't stop to investigate. I got into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine, my hands shaking so badly I could barely control the wheel. I drove without stopping, the forest fading behind me. When I finally reached a gas station in a small town miles away, I pulled over, trying to calm myself. The print, the scratches, the tapping, it all felt unreal. But it was real enough to make me swear I would never return to a cabin in the woods alone. A week later, I learned from the cabin's owner that there had been a recent series of break-ins in that area. Thieves had been scouting secluded cabins, waiting for people to arrive, and sometimes leaving just enough evidence to unsettle their victims. They were never violent if discovered but would ransack and steal quickly. I realized that the scratching, the tapping, the footprint, it hadn't been paranormal. It hadn't been my imagination. Someone had been watching me, and I had narrowly avoided a confrontation. After that experience, I decided I would never rent a cabin in the middle of nowhere again. The isolation that I once thought would be peaceful had almost turned into a nightmare. I installed better locks on my doors at home, bought a security system, and swore I would always let someone know exactly where I was. I still think about that night sometimes, the way the shadows moved, the sound of the tapping, and the feeling of being watched. But I also think about how I got out safely, how I kept my wits, and how I learned to respect the quiet danger that can hide in remote places. The forest is beautiful, but I now know beauty can hide something else entirely. Something patient, watching, and very real. And I will never underestimate that again. By the second night, the fear had grown into something heavier. The wind picked up outside, rattling the cabin and shaking the trees. Every sound was amplified, the hoot of an owl, the snap of a twig, the rush of the river. I slept in my clothes, boots on, the knife still close, listening to every little noise. I thought about staying awake, keeping watch, but the exhaustion won. Sleep came in short bursts, restless and filled with dreams of someone, or something, moving outside. Morning brought no relief. I discovered that someone had been inside the cabin. Nothing major, nothing stolen, but small things were out of place. A chair slightly shifted, a blanket on the bed disturbed, the firewood I had stacked neatly scattered a little. Whoever had come in hadn't taken anything, but the fact that they could enter unnoticed made my stomach twist. I realized I needed to leave, But when I checked the car, the tires were stuck in soft dirt. I tried to push it, but the car didn't move. Panic rose in my chest. I had no phone signal. I was trapped. I spent the day trying to dig out the car, moving dirt and rocks, using pieces of firewood for leverage. Every few minutes, I thought I saw shadows between the trees, movements that didn't belong to birds or deer. I started carrying my flashlight with me, shining it into the woods even in daylight, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever had been following me. I found more footprints, fresh and close to the cabin. The fear became almost physical, a tightness in my chest, a weight pressing down on me. I realized that the person or people had been watching me for hours, maybe even days. Night came again, and I decided I couldn't stay inside. I had to get out. I packed what I could into a small bag: water, snacks, my knife, my flashlight, and left the cabin, moving toward the road on foot. The forest was dark and oppressive, every sound making me flinch. I followed the narrow dirt path, trying to keep my eyes on the faint trail that led back to the main road. My boots slipped in the mud, my legs ached, but I kept going, driven by the knowledge that staying in the cabin meant danger. I was halfway to the road when I heard voices. Faint, muffled, but definitely human. My heart stopped. I ducked behind a tree, trying to make myself small, hoping they wouldn't see me. I could hear footsteps approaching, breaking branches underfoot, getting closer. I stayed completely still, holding my breath. The figures passed without noticing me, talking quietly, searching. I waited until the sounds faded into the distance, my chest heaving, my legs trembling. Then I ran. I ran as fast as I could, not caring if I got scratched by branches, not caring about the mud, just moving toward the road, toward safety. I finally emerged onto the main road in the early hours of the morning, exhausted, dirty, and terrified. A car drove by, and I ran toward it, waving my arms until the driver stopped. I told them I needed help, that I had been trapped in the woods, that someone had been watching me. They called the police. I waited in the car until they arrived, shivering and shaking, replaying every detail over and over in my mind. The police drove me back to the cabin during the daylight. It looked innocent again, quiet and still, the forest seemingly normal. But the footprints, the broken branches, the signs of intrusion, they were all there. They couldn't find anyone. No one was hiding nearby. But they took notes, collected evidence, and warned me not to go back alone. I packed up what I could, left the cabin secured as best I could, and drove away. Weeks later, I went through the footage from my small camera I had brought for hiking. I had set it up in the cabin to record the river, thinking I could capture some wildlife. But in some frames, faint shadows appeared, movements that I hadn't noticed at the time. Not ghosts, not supernatural, just human shapes. People had been there, watching me, waiting for the right moment. I realized how close I had come to a real disaster. The experience changed me. I learned to trust my instincts, to respect isolation, to understand that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or legends. They're real people, real threats, and situations that can go wrong in ways you can't predict. I never went back to that cabin. I still think about it sometimes. The fear I felt, the hours I spent crouched in the forest, hoping I wouldn't be seen. I learned to be careful, to prepare, to respect the wild, and most importantly, to never assume safety in isolation. I eventually returned to nature in controlled ways, in groups, with communication devices, with plans for emergencies. I didn't let that one terrifying experience stop me from loving the outdoors, but it gave me a healthy respect for how unpredictable and dangerous isolation can be. The cabin, the footprints, the watching figures, they were all real, a stark reminder that fear doesn't need to be made up to be deadly. Even now, years later, when I walk through a quiet forest, I feel the tension in my chest, the prickles on my skin, the awareness that someone could be watching from the shadows. It's not a ghost story, it's not a legend, it's just reality. And sometimes, reality is far scarier than anything you could imagine. I got up slowly, heart pounding. I wanted to check, but fear kept me frozen halfway. I stood near the bed, barely breathing, staring at the window. The noise stopped, then silence. I waited still for almost an hour before I dared move again. I didn't sleep at all after that. In the morning, I walked around again. The back wall had faint marks near the window, tiny scratches, almost like something had rubbed against it. I checked the lock again. It was still fine, but now I noticed something else. Under the window, hidden between the logs, there was a small gap, like a piece of the wall had shifted slightly. You couldn't see it unless you crouched. It looked like someone had pried the wood a little. I told myself it might have been old damage. The cabin was probably decades old. But now the silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. Felt watchful. I decided to cut my trip short. I planned to leave the next morning, pack up everything and drive back. But that night turned out worse than the rest. I tried to stay awake as long as I could. I sat near the fireplace, reading, drinking coffee, keeping the lantern on. Around 2 a.m., I started hearing it again. The same slow steps outside, circling the cabin. I could tell it was footsteps this time, not animals. The sound of weight pressing on wood, shifting on the dirt. Then came the sound of the back door handle, softly, slowly, turning. I froze completely. I watched the handle shake just once, then silence. After a while, I heard the faintest sound, breathing again, right outside the door. Minutes passed. I didn't move. The fire burned low again, the room dark except for the faint glow. Then, suddenly, the sound of something tapping on the wall, slow, steady, like someone pressing a finger against the wood. 3 times. Then silence. I couldn't stay still anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly checked every corner inside. Everything was locked. The windows were shut. Nothing was moved. But I knew someone was out there. I didn't know how close or why. I stayed awake till morning, sitting near the window, watching the woods until daylight came. As soon as the sun was up, I packed everything as fast as I could. I loaded my bag, locked the cabin, and went to the car. But when I got in, the car wouldn't start. The engine turned but wouldn't catch. I tried again and again, but it just clicked. My hands started shaking. I opened the hood, checked what I could, but I knew nothing about engines. Everything looked normal. I looked around the trees, trying to calm down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. I decided to walk. The nearest road was about 5 miles back, according to the map. I took a bottle of water, locked the car, and started walking fast. The forest was quiet, but I kept looking behind me. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something following, branches snapping, faint footsteps, maybe echoes of my own. When I finally reached the main road, I felt like I could breathe again. A few hours later, a truck passed by and gave me a lift to town. Later that day, I called the owner of the cabin to tell him what happened. He seemed calm, said he'd send someone to check the place. I didn't tell him everything, just that I'd heard noises and that the car wouldn't start. A few days later, I got a call from him. He told me something strange. When he went to the cabin, he found the back door unlocked, even though I'd locked it before leaving. Inside, some of the floorboards in the storage closet were loose. Underneath, there was a small space like a crawl area just big enough for a person to fit. Inside it, he found a blanket, a few empty cans of food, and some old clothes. That was when it hit me. Someone had been living under the cabin, probably for a long time. They must have come out at night when they heard someone new inside. Maybe they'd been living there quietly, unnoticed, using the woods for food, sleeping during the day. I had spent 3 nights there, not knowing that someone was hiding just a few feet beneath me. After that, I stopped renting remote places. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd been to something I never saw. Every small sound, every scratch I heard that weekend, it wasn't the wind, it wasn't animals. It was someone who lived in the dark, listening while I slept, moving through the same walls that kept me feeling safe. Even now, when I think about it, I remember the soft creak of those steps, the quiet tapping on the wall, and the cold realization that I wasn't alone at all. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of a small cabin in the woods, miles from anyone else, seemed like the perfect way to escape the noise and pressure of daily life. I wanted silence, solitude, and the kind of isolation that made the world feel distant. The cabin itself was an old rental tucked into a dense part of the forest, far enough from the main road that GPS reception was spotty at best. When I drove up the winding dirt path for the first time, the smell of wet earth and pine needles hit me immediately. It was heavy, earthy, and so different from the stale air of the city that it made me inhale deeply, wanting to absorb every bit of it. The cabin was small but sturdy, a rough wooden structure with a metal roof. It looked like it had been there for decades. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and some of the boards creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it. I carried my backpack inside and set it down on the floor. The interior smelled faintly of smoke and old wood. Dust coated some surfaces, and the corners were thick with cobwebs. A layer of grime on the windows made the forest outside appear muted, as if viewed through a haze. The furniture was basic. A table with 2 chairs, a small sofa that looked uncomfortable, and a bed with a thin mattress. There was a small wood stove in the corner, rusted and blackened from years of use, and I could see an old stack of firewood beside it. I spent the first few hours exploring the area around the cabin. The forest was thick, with towering pines and birch trees forming a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen branches and leaves. I noticed animal tracks here and there, deer probably, but maybe something else. I couldn't tell for sure. The nearest sign of civilization was the dirt road I had driven in on, winding away from the cabin and disappearing behind a hill. Beyond that, I had no idea how far it went or if anyone ever traveled it. That night, I made a fire in the stove and settled in for the evening. The wind picked up outside, rustling the trees in a way that sounded almost like whispers. I told myself it was just the wind, but there was a tension in the air that I couldn't ignore. I ate the simple food I had brought, mostly canned goods and some bread, and tried to distract myself by reading. The shadows in the corners of the cabin seemed darker than they should have been, stretching in ways that made me glance over my shoulder more than once. I kept the door locked, checking it repeatedly even though I knew there was nothing out there. Still, the sense of being watched settled in my stomach like a heavy stone. The first night passed without incident, though I barely slept. Every snap of a branch outside made me jump, and every gust of wind sounded like someone moving through the trees. I kept thinking I could hear footsteps in the distance, though when I strained my ears, the forest was silent. Morning brought a brief sense of relief, sunlight pouring through the grimy windows, making the cabin feel less oppressive. I went outside to stretch, breathing in the cold, crisp air. The forest looked peaceful in the light, with birds flitting between branches and the wind moving gently through the leaves. Over the next day, I settled into a routine. I gathered firewood, explored the surrounding trails, and tried to keep my mind busy. But as the hours passed, I started noticing small things that made me uneasy. My backpack, which I had set down in the corner, seemed slightly moved. A can I had left on the counter was now closer to the edge. At first, I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness, but the unease built steadily. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like someone, or something, was watching me from the forest, even though no one was there. The third day was when things began to feel truly wrong. I had gone to collect water from a nearby stream, following a path I had marked the day before. When I returned, the cabin door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it. My heart raced as I stepped inside, scanning the room for any sign of disturbance. Nothing seemed out of place except that my backpack was now on the floor instead of on the chair. I felt a chill run down my spine. I went through every corner of the cabin, checking the windows and doors. Everything was locked as it should be now, but the sense of intrusion stayed with me. That night, the wind howled louder than ever, and the forest felt alive in a way that was not natural. Every shadow seemed to move just a little. Every creak in the cabin made me tense. I decided to stay awake as long as possible, keeping the fire going and checking the windows frequently. At some point, I heard a faint scratching on the outer wall, like claws dragging across wood. I froze, listening. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? Maybe a raccoon or a bear. but something about the rhythm of the scratching didn't feel like an animal at all. The next morning, I found deep tracks in the soft earth around the cabin. They were large, bigger than a human foot, but too irregular to be normal animal tracks. They circled the cabin in a way that suggested something had been pacing, watching, waiting. I felt trapped. For the first time, the isolation of the cabin became a threat rather than a relief. I thought about leaving immediately, but the road was slippery from the rain, and my car was parked a mile away at the edge of the forest. I decided to stay put and keep the cabin secured. I gathered every piece of firewood I could find and stacked it near the door, thinking that if something came, I would at least have a barrier. It started as a trip I thought would be simple. I had been wanting to escape the city for a while. The endless noise, the crowds, the stress that never seemed to leave me. A friend had told me about a small cabin tucked away in the woods of northern Idaho. It was old but solid, with a river not far away and dense trees all around. The thought of being alone in nature appealed to me, a chance to disconnect from everything and just breathe. I rented the cabin online, confident that the pictures were accurate, confident that nothing could go wrong. I had done trips like this before, but somehow I felt more drawn to this one. Something about its isolation made it feel like I could disappear for a while and maybe find some peace. I arrived late afternoon, the sun low in the sky, turning everything orange and gold. The cabin sat on a small rise, surrounded by pine and fir trees. A narrow dirt path led up to it, barely visible in places, and I drove slowly, worrying that I might have to backtrack if the ground got softer or muddier. I parked my car in the small clearing next to the cabin, unloaded my backpack and supplies, and just stood there for a moment, taking it in. The air smelled like pine and wet earth, the kind of smell that made your lungs feel like they were finally breathing real air. I could hear the river in the distance, a constant, low roar over the sounds of the forest. The cabin itself was simple. 2 rooms, a small kitchen area, a bathroom, and a living space with a wood stove. Everything inside looked older but clean, and the furniture was heavy and made of solid wood. There was a small stack of firewood next to the stove, a few blankets on the beds, and a lantern hanging from a hook by the door. I unpacked slowly, placing my things carefully on the shelves and tables. The cabin had no electricity except for a small solar panel outside, and no phone signal reached here, but that was exactly why I came. I wanted to be cut off. I wanted to feel like the world outside didn't exist. The first evening passed quietly. I chopped some wood, set the stove, and made a simple meal. The sun dipped behind the trees, and soon darkness covered the forest like a thick blanket. The cabin's windows were small and the glass a little foggy, so I couldn't see much outside, only vague shadows and the occasional glimmer of the river. I lit the lantern and read a book until I felt my eyelids growing heavy. I went to sleep feeling safe, even excited. But when I woke the next morning, the forest felt different. It wasn't that anything had changed. Not yet. It was just quieter. The birds weren't singing as much, and the wind didn't rustle the branches the same way. I brushed it off as my imagination, grabbed breakfast, and planned my day. I wanted to explore the river a little, maybe follow one of the trails I had seen on the map. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, a knife, and a flashlight and stepped out. The woods were dense, the trail narrow and winding. I walked along, feeling the crunch of leaves under my boots, the smell of wet earth strong after an overnight mist. I kept the cabin in sight at first, a small wooden shape between the trees, and then it disappeared as I ventured further. The river grew louder, rushing over rocks and forming small pools along the way. I followed it for a few hours, climbing over fallen logs, avoiding slippery banks, and feeling completely alone. The solitude was peaceful, but there was an underlying tension I couldn't shake. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anyone besides the river and the wind. That silence can be louder than any noise if you're alone long enough. I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, tired but satisfied. I noticed something then, a trail of footprints in the soft dirt near the cabin. At first, I thought maybe I had imagined them or that a small animal had made them. But they were definitely human, too big and heavy to be an animal. They led from the edge of the trees toward the cabin and then back into the forest. My stomach sank. I wasn't expecting anyone else to be here. I remembered the location of the cabin. It was isolated. No neighbors for miles. The road was rough and overgrown. No one should have been here. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, feeling the first prickles of fear. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone passing by on the trail. Maybe hunters. Maybe someone had stumbled onto the cabin by mistake. I told myself all of these things, but my heart still raced. That night, I barely slept. Every rustle outside made me sit up. Every shadow on the wall made me tense. I kept the knife from my bag close to my bed, feeling its cold metal against my fingers. I tried to calm myself by listening to the river, reminding myself that there was no immediate threat, that I was alone and safe. The next day, I tried to go about my routine, chopping wood, cooking breakfast, tidying up, but the feeling of being watched never left. I started noticing small things. Footprints again, deeper in the dirt this time, closer to the cabin, and occasionally broken branches that suggested someone had been moving through the woods nearby. I didn't hear anyone directly, didn't see anyone, but the evidence was there. I thought about leaving, but the road back was long, and it would be dark soon. I decided to stay, convincing myself I would just be more careful.